If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push, they float. The air doesn't move right now. Somewhere in the room, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe, only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that only meant to stay a minute. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. She never touched the crown, but it bent her spine anyway. That's the kind of thing they don't tell you about ancient Egypt power. Sometimes you rule by holding something so soft. It leaves no mark on your skin, but your shoulders remember. Cleopatra knew this. She wasn't born into the throne. Not really. She was born into a palace filled with walls that whispered her name, but not out loud. They just held it, like a breath in a hollow room. At night, she learned to sit still, to listen for the soft noises that meant something had shifted. A sandal scraping stone in the wrong hallway, a servant taking a longer route back to the kitchen, a curtain moving, even when the wind wasn't there. Her father had shown her what power looked like when it crumbled. Ptolemy XII, they called him sometimes the flute player, sometimes the king of bribes. He smiled too much, and when he didn't know what to do, he played music louder like sound could cover weakness. But Cleopatra saw through that. She learned early. The loudest room isn't the one with power, it's the one hiding from silence. And so, she chose the opposite. She let the room grow still. She let the silk curtains settle. She let the hush wrap around her, soft and dim, until everyone forgot she was there. That's where real ancient Egypt power lived. Not in the throne room, in the gaps between conversations, in the quiet places that decided what happened next before anyone said it out loud. Some historians debate whether this was strategy or survival. Did Cleopatra choose the soft path because it worked, or because it was the only one left? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe that's just how it feels when you're born into a palace where no one is really safe. The walls were still painted with lotus flowers. The ceiling still shimmered with gold. But underneath all that, the empire was hollowing out, slowly, like a peach left too long in the sun. And Cleopatra, she wasn't interested in saving what was rotting. She was interested in staying soft, staying still, staying quiet long enough to reshape it. There's a trick to being invisible while holding everything in your hands. You have to pretend you're not holding anything at all. The river outside kept moving, but inside, she learned to wait without looking like she was waiting. Her tutors spoke of geometry, poetry, law, but she learned something else. She learned how to make silence do the work for her. That's a strange kind of kingdom, isn't it? A kingdom where no one sings your name because it's safer that way. A kingdom where you listen more than you speak, because speaking would break the spell. Sometimes, you wonder if she ever slept. Did Cleopatra drift off like you, with the sound of her own breath in the dark? Or did she keep one ear soft and hollow, listening for footsteps that never came? You don't have to answer that. The night isn't asking you for facts. It's just offering a place to sit still, beside someone who ruled by not being seen. The walls of the palace in Alexandria weren't built for echoes. They were built to muffle sound, to keep whispers soft and decisions softer. That's the part of ancient Egypt power no one carves into stone. It wasn't just about hieroglyphs or gods or crowns. It was about learning to control a room without standing in the center of it. Cleopatra didn't need to announce herself. In fact, she understood something sharper. Presence is sometimes louder when it's quiet. She had watched too many men mistake noise for power, watched them rattle coins in Rome, wave swords in the streets, shout their victories across marble halls. But volume fades fast. It echoes for a moment, then disappears into walls that no one remembers. Silence, on the other hand, lingers. It stays in the corner of the room, just out of reach, gently twisting everything around it. At 17, Cleopatra sat with her mother's jewelry box and studied how each piece caught the dim light differently. A sapphire flickered like water, a gold bracelet swallowed shadows. Power, she realized, could do the same thing. It could reflect or it could absorb, and the ones who survived longest learned how to do both. There's no surviving court politics if you don't know how to listen first, not just to words, but to the hollow spaces between them, the gaps where real meaning slips out. Cleopatra learned this not in grand lessons, but in soft, still moments when no one thought she was watching. She noticed who left early, who stayed too long, who paused before speaking. She counted silences as carefully as others counted coins. Some historians still argue about how much she actually controlled at that age. Did she really have the reins of ancient Egypt power before her coronation? Or did she just sit quietly enough to make the world think she did? The records are soft on that point, blurred like ink left in the rain. But there's one thing no one debates: she knew how to stay in the room without stepping forward. She could let others speak first, let them weigh down the air with plans and threats and complicated alliances. And then, with a voice barely louder than breath, she could say something simple, a single line that would shift the entire map. Imagine that skill, being so softly present, so still, that people stop noticing you're there, until suddenly, they realize they've built their strategy around your silence. It's a dangerous gift, and it came with a cost. Some nights, Cleopatra would sit by a window facing the harbor, her face dimly lit by the oil lamps below. She'd watch the ships drift in from Rome, their sails like hollow teeth in the wind. Trade caravans brought silk, spices, and news. Most of that news came in fragments: who had been assassinated, who was rising, who had fallen out of favor. She gathered these soft threads, not as facts, but as materials to weave something of her own. Her world wasn't made of borders and battles, it was made of timing. And in Alexandria, timing was everything. The Nile didn't just flood because the gods commanded it. It flooded because time worked differently here. Life in Egypt followed the river, not the clock. So Cleopatra didn't rush. She let things arrive slowly. Alliances, betrayals, whispered rumors about Rome's Senate losing its grip. She learned that patience was sometimes sharper than a sword. She didn't need to remind anyone she was Ptolemaic royalty. They knew, but lineage was soft currency by then. Rome had already swallowed most of the Mediterranean. Egypt was technically free, but everyone knew freedom was now a matter of negotiation, not fact. Cleopatra didn't play the loud game. She played the one no one else wanted, the game of waiting, of smiling just long enough to make someone wonder what you meant, of letting silence pool between words until the other person panicked and filled it for you. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy. You've probably felt that before, haven't you? In your own life, the meeting where you chose not to speak first, the conversation where you let someone else reveal too much because you stayed quiet just a second longer. That's not manipulation, that's observation. It's knowing that stillness can sometimes do more than movement. That's how she ruled before anyone called her queen. There's an old Egyptian saying, "The mouth can lie, but the breath cannot." Cleopatra understood this better than most. She watched how people exhaled when they thought they were safe, how their shoulders softened when they thought no one was listening. That's when she learned the real shape of the world around her, not from proclamations, but from the faint sighs of those who believed they were alone. And in a way, so was she. Ruling softly means holding a kind of loneliness other people don't see. It means knowing secrets you can't share, even with the ones you love. It means hearing the gears of politics grind in the background while pretending you're only listening to music. It means carrying weight without letting it crease your clothes. Sometimes she wondered, did her father know this feeling, or had he drowned it out with flutes and laughter? Cleopatra wasn't like him. She didn't need distraction. She needed direction, and she found it in stillness. She surrounded herself with scholars, mathematicians, philosophers, but these weren't just teachers. They were pieces of armor. Knowledge made her soft power stronger. Speaking 9 languages helped, but listening in 9 languages helped more. She understood the gaps between Greek and Egyptian, between Rome's Senate Latin and the Coptic murmurs of the market. She understood what wasn't said. In the soft corners of the palace, where the oil lamps flickered low, she memorized the rhythm of a power shifting around her, a trade agreement signed too quickly, a Roman envoy staying one day longer than planned. These were the true markers of control, not the public ceremonies, but the private pauses. This wasn't just politics. This was personal survival. And it wasn't over yet. The palace was a living diagram of how ancient Egypt power worked, not through grand halls or jeweled crowns, but through rooms designed for listening. Walls didn't just divide space. They filtered sound, softening it into something manageable, something private. Behind one set of curtains, decisions about trade routes were made. Behind another, quiet agreements about marriages and alliances unfolded. And sometimes, the most important agreements were the ones that no one signed, spoken only in lowered voices that vanished as soon as they were heard. Cleopatra walked through these spaces, knowing precisely where the soft spots were, the corners where servants lingered, the archways where a smile could carry more weight than a law. Power, she understood, wasn't about standing at the center of attention. It was about knowing when to disappear from the center and still control the outcome. She didn't need the marble seat at the front of the room when she could reshape the conversation from the shadows. Her early lessons came not from books, but from watching how adults performed control and how often they failed at it. She saw her father return from Rome with his shoulders slumped, covered in gold, yet somehow carrying less authority than when he left. She noticed how advisors, who once spoke with certainty, now filled their sentences with soft pauses, worried about what wasn't being said rather than what was. The empire was fragile, but no one admitted it directly. That fragility drifted through the palace like a smell, faint but unmistakable. Cleopatra learned to breathe with that fragility instead of fighting it. She mastered the art of patience, letting negotiations circle for days before softly offering a solution that had been clear to her from the start. This wasn't manipulation in the way her enemies would later describe it. It was survival by absorption, taking in the mood of the room, letting it settle, and only then making her move. There's a pattern to this kind of rule, and it's older than any dynasty. Across history, rulers have often balanced 2 kinds of power, the loud and the still. The loud commands armies, builds monuments, and stages public rituals. The still commands memory, reshapes alliances quietly, and ensures that decisions happen in small, unnoticed moments. Cleopatra knew both types, but preferred the second, knowing that empires crumble less from loud failures than from soft hesitations no one dares acknowledge. Historians often debate whether Cleopatra's early political moves were her own or orchestrated by her advisors. Was she truly the architect of her influence, or merely the face of it? The truth, as always, is hollowed out by time. But consider this: she chose her tutors herself. She studied law, science, and rhetoric with a focus sharper than her siblings ever displayed. She read scrolls about medicine and astronomy, yes, but she also read the social maps of those around her, memorizing who favored Rome, who resented it, and who quietly dreamed of rebellion. For her, knowledge wasn't just academic, it was armor, soft but impenetrable. It's easy to imagine her standing on a balcony overlooking Alexandria, watching the city drift into dusk. The harbor would glow faintly with torchlight, boats moving like slow shadows across the water. She knew which merchants had paid Rome's taxes and which hadn't. She understood the quiet resentments forming in alleyways, the shifting loyalties in the governor's chambers. Power wasn't in the statues or the temples. It was in the soft, cumulative knowledge of who owed what to whom, and who might change sides if pressed gently enough. Sometimes she spoke with scholars late into the night, not because she needed their lessons, but because she needed their silence after the words faded. She wanted to hear what they didn't say. That was the real curriculum. It wasn't about the number of languages she could speak, or the complexity of the political theories she memorized. It was about learning when a pause meant more than a proclamation. This method of rule, this soft, still leadership carried risks. One risk was loneliness. When you let others think they're the loudest voice in the room, they often forget you're even there. Cleopatra experienced this often, sometimes by design, sometimes as consequence. Her brothers underestimated her. Her courtiers whispered without realizing she was listening. Rome dismissed her as just another exotic ruler, draped in silk but ultimately powerless. That was their mistake. They thought the silk was the point. They didn't realize it was the silence beneath the silk that mattered. By the time she officially took the throne, Cleopatra had already spent years exercising ancient Egypt power without formal ceremony. She had sent letters that never bore her name but still changed lives. She had made trade decisions that rippled through the markets without anyone knowing who had signed off on them. And she had positioned herself carefully between factions, never fully aligning with any side, but allowing each to think she might. Some historians call this political manipulation. But in a world where women rulers were rare and empires collapsed under louder, more violent leadership, perhaps it's better to call it soft navigation and ability to move through dangerous waters without splashing too much. Imagine trying that today. Imagine living in a system where speaking too loudly means becoming a target, but staying too quiet means vanishing completely. Cleopatra walked that line daily, adjusting her tone, her gaze, her alliances like someone tuning a delicate instrument. One wrong note, and the whole palace could fall into chaos. One too loud command, and Rome might have seen her as a threat worth removing immediately. Instead, she ruled softly, stilly, in ways that made her presence both constant and invisible. She wasn't just surviving. She was reshaping the idea of what rule could look like, less about iron control, and more about hollow space, where decisions flow naturally toward you because you've left no resistance in their path. Some nights, she probably wondered whether this way of life would leave any trace. Would anyone remember the negotiations she prevented from becoming wars? Would anyone tell stories about the silences she curated, the pauses she extended, the soft agreements she crafted between sips of wine and moments of stillness? Maybe not. Maybe ruling without being seen means accepting that most of your victories dissolve into the air, leaving no monument behind. But Cleopatra had something better than monuments. She had time, and she used it softly. You don't always need a map to know where the borders are. Sometimes, the lines are drawn in pauses, not in ink. Cleopatra learned this in the quiet spaces between meetings, in the subtle tilts of heads at court, in the soft weight of a silence that lasted just a moment too long. The politics of ancient Egypt power didn't move in straight lines. It curled, folded, and reappeared in places no one expected. And Cleopatra, long before she was officially queen, became an expert in navigating these invisible routes. There were maps, of course, sprawled across tables in dimly lit rooms, edges curling, corners marked with symbols that only a few understood. Traders charted grain shipments, and Rome's envoys traced military outposts with ink-stained fingers. But Cleopatra's maps were different. Hers were made of human patterns. She memorized who paused before answering a question, who changed the subject when asked about taxes, who smiled just a little too long after mentioning Caesar's name. These were the real borders, the fragile spaces between loyalty and betrayal. between allegiance and ambition. In this soft architecture of influence, Cleopatra worked not with soldiers or fleets, but with gestures so small they were almost invisible. A look across a banquet table, a cup of wine poured at just the right moment, a whispered greeting in the market delivered through a trusted handmaid. Each of these actions carried more strategic weight than a legion of men. And because they were soft, because they were still, no one could accuse her of treason or overreach. No one could point to a single moment and say, "Here is where she seized control," but somehow, she always had it. Historians debate the extent of this early power. Some suggest she was simply more observant than her siblings, more attuned to the rhythms of palace life. Others argue that she manipulated the court from a young age, bending Alexandria's factions around her without ever raising her voice. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. She wasn't trying to control everything. She was simply arranging things softly, like someone folding cloth, adjusting, smoothing, letting the fabric settle where it wanted, but guiding the corners just enough to shape the final form. In the evenings, when the palace grew dim and the city's noise drifted away, Cleopatra often walked the colonnades alone. The soft sandals of her feet made no sound on the polished stone. She would pass the carved pillars, each one older than Rome itself, and pause to watch the flickering lights on the water. The harbor was still, but beneath that stillness, ships were moving, deals were being made, loyalties were shifting like sand. She knew that what appeared solid was always quietly rearranging itself underneath. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Her father had taught her, intentionally or not, that loud rulers fall faster. Ptolemy XII had been too obvious, too desperate for Rome's approval, and the people of Egypt had noticed. When they spoke of him in the streets, it was with soft ridicule, calling him the flute player king because he played music while the empire decayed. Cleopatra saw the cost of that kind of rule, the kind that seeks attention without securing stability. She resolved not to repeat it. Instead, she mastered the art of indirect guidance. When two advisors argued, she didn't interrupt. She let them finish, let the room go still again, and only then offered a suggestion so calm, so faintly delivered, that it sounded like something they had thought of themselves. That was the trick to make others believe they were in control while softly guiding the outcome. Power that feels like permission lasts longer than power that feels like command. This kind of leadership requires patience, the kind of patience most rulers never develop. Cleopatra was willing to wait. She waited for the right moment to speak, for the right alliance to shift, for Rome to grow distracted enough to let her maneuver. Waiting wasn't passive for her. It was an active practice, a discipline she refined over years. Some people use swords to cut through problems. Cleopatra used time. Consider the silk merchants who arrived from the east, bringing fabrics so delicate they seemed woven from air. Cleopatra didn't just buy silk for its beauty. She understood its message. When she draped herself in imported cloth, she reminded the court and Rome that Egypt still had connections beyond Caesar, beyond the Senate, beyond the world they controlled. Every soft fold of fabric whispered that her kingdom was part of a larger network, one they couldn't fully touch. This was a kind of political map, too, one drawn not in battle lines, but in texture and trade. And it terrified Rome. The Senate hated ambiguity. They preferred clear hierarchies, clear enemies, clear borders. But Cleopatra offered none of that. She didn't behave like a client ruler, bowing and scraping for Roman approval. She behaved like a still current beneath the surface of their plans, too soft to catch, too dim to confront directly, yet always there. That kind of power is unnerving because it can't be cornered. It can't be assassinated in the forum or overthrown with a vote. It just continues. There's a reason whispers outlast proclamations. Even today, when you read about Cleopatra, you'll notice how often her strategies are reduced to spectacle. They talk about the carpet, how she wrapped herself inside it to meet Caesar. They talk about her gilded barge, her perfumes, her dazzling entrances, but these are just the visible parts of a much softer system. The real empire she managed wasn't made of gold or silk. It was made of silences, delays, and decisions that looked like coincidences. Sometimes she must have wondered whether it would be enough. When you rule softly, you carry a certain kind of doubt. No statues record your subtle victories. No historians write down the exact moment you prevented a war by letting someone else speak first. You have to live with the knowledge that your greatest successes will feel, to others, like nothing happened at all. That's not failure. It's just the nature of soft rule. And Cleopatra knew this. She also knew that eventually, Rome would demand clarity. They would ask for definitions, friend or foe, ally or enemy. They would not tolerate ambiguity forever. But for now, she could still work in the quiet space between their expectations, letting her influence spread like a shadow, soft and hollow and just out of reach. When you control the timing of a room, you don't need to raise your voice. You only need to wait until the others realize they're speaking into your silence. And in Alexandria, the palace air was thick with that realization, even if no one dared to say it out loud. The myth of leadership is often tied to spectacle, history, especially the kind carved into monuments or painted onto walls, tends to favor the loudest moments, the coronations, the victories in battle, the dramatic speeches given from marble balconies. But real ancient Egypt power was rarely built in moments like these. For Cleopatra, it was built in the spaces between them, in the soft, near-invisible acts of negotiation and adjustment, in the gentle redirection of outcomes before anyone noticed they had shifted. She learned early that ruling through spectacle meant surrendering to it. Once you became part of the show, you could no longer control the script. Cleopatra chose instead to stay behind the curtain, influencing the narrative without becoming the story. There were no declarations from balconies, no proclamations echoed through the streets. Her power moved like incense smoke, faint, persistent, impossible to catch, yet altering the air around everyone who breathed it. Much of this work happened in the small routines of daily life. Cleopatra understood that politics didn't just happen in courtrooms or councils. It happened at banquets, in corridors, during idle conversations in the library. She arranged these moments carefully, knowing who sat where, who overheard what, and who left the room thinking they had come to a decision all on their own. Soft governance, when done well, makes people believe they are acting freely, even when their choices have been quietly shaped in advance. This was not a new strategy. Generations of queens and advisors had used similar tactics in royal courts across the world. But Cleopatra refined it into something closer to an art form. She wasn't content to simply be present. She wanted to dissolve into the background until her influence was so diffused that no one could remove it without dismantling the entire system. Consider how she used the court's servants not as mere laborers, but as subtle messengers. In the palace, news didn't travel formally. It traveled in whispers. A kitchen maid might mention the arrival of a Roman envoy while pouring wine. A stable hand might quietly spread word of a delayed grain shipment. These fragments of information floated between courtiers, soft as breath, until they carried more weight than official reports. Cleopatra encouraged this system, letting information trickle instead of thunder. She knew that people trust what feels like rumor more than what feels like command. Her scholars and tutors played roles in this system as well. They weren't just sources of knowledge, they were tools of calibration. She would ask them not only about astronomy and medicine, but also about human nature, how people responded to uncertainty, how fear shaped decisions, how small comforts could redirect entire lives. The mechanics of governance were not only about laws or taxes. They were about understanding what people needed to believe in order to remain cooperative. Cleopatra's relationship with her advisors was soft, not strict. She let them speak openly in private, creating an environment where disagreement was allowed as long as it stayed behind closed doors. This strategy wasn't born of kindness alone, it was tactical. When people feel heard, they reveal more. When they believe they are part of a decision, they become loyal to the outcome, even if the final choice wasn't theirs to begin with. Of course, this approach required discipline. It's easier, in some ways, to rule by force or fear. Louder power is simpler to maintain in the short term because it demands obedience. But loud power burns quickly. It collapses when the ruler's strength fades or when a louder rival arrives. Cleopatra chose the slower path, knowing that soft systems endure longer because they are woven into everyday life. They are not built atop a throne, but beneath it, in the ordinary rhythms that no one thinks to question. Her alliances followed the same pattern. When she forged relationships with regional leaders, she didn't demand loyalty outright. Instead, she offered favors that could not easily be repaid, subtle gifts that created obligations without formal contracts. A shipment of grain during a drought, a gentle intervention in a dispute between two rival governors. These were not acts of charity. They were investments in long-term influence, strands of connection that held quietly in place long after treaties had been forgotten. This method extended beyond Egypt's borders. Cleopatra's soft diplomacy reached into Rome itself. She sent envoys not to argue, but to observe, to note, who lingered near the Senate steps after meetings, who whispered in the corners of marble chambers, who seemed more anxious than usual. This was intelligence gathering at its softest. Not espionage in the dramatic sense, but the careful listening to atmospheres, the reading of moods across seas and empires. And there was the question of succession, always present, always delicate. Cleopatra knew that ensuring her family's survival meant thinking beyond her own lifetime. She didn't simply imagine her children on the throne. She imagined a system in which they could survive the politics that would follow her. To do this, she began shaping Egypt's perception of them early, not with grand announcements, but with quiet reinforcement. The children were included in religious ceremonies, their images painted alongside hers in temples, not because they held power yet, but because their presence needed to become normal before it became necessary. All of this was risky. Of course, soft power can be misunderstood, especially by louder rivals. In Rome, Cleopatra's approach was often mocked or dismissed. They preferred directness, even when it was brutal. The Senate could not comprehend a queen who ruled by not ruling openly, who influenced by seeming absent. They called her manipulative, dangerous, a threat cloaked in silk. But that was their projection, not her reality. What frightened them wasn't manipulation, it was subtlety. Rome knew how to crush armies. But how do you defeat someone who changes the entire mood of a room simply by leaving it? Sometimes, in the quiet of her chambers, Cleopatra must have wondered how long this balance could hold. How long could one guide an empire through silence and softness before someone demanded noise? She was not naive. She understood that history favored conquerors, not caretakers of stillness, but she also understood that someone had to hold the fragile center while others played at war. Someone had to be the hollow reed bending in the wind, surviving storms by not resisting them. That's not weakness, it's design. And in Egypt, design mattered. The pyramids weren't built for show, they were built for endurance. Cleopatra patterned her rule the same way, quiet, deliberate, intended to outlast. There's a kind of strength in staying still while the world demands motion. A kind of courage in letting others think they lead while you rearrange the map beneath their feet. She had seen what happened to rulers who mistook volume for longevity. Their names were carved in stone. Yes, but stone erodes. Memory doesn't. Not if you plant it softly enough. By the time the world realized how much she had shaped, it was already too late to undo it. And somewhere in the soft corners of her palace, where the lamps burned low and the city's noise faded into the sea breeze, Cleopatra sat quietly. She was not waiting for permission to act. She had already acted. The empire just hadn't noticed yet. Power that moves quietly often leaves behind the faintest footprints, but they are the kind that last the longest. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone alive at the time. For her, ancient Egypt power was not about claiming space with force, but about reshaping space with intention softly, carefully, and with a patience that unnerved her rivals more than any army ever could. She had learned from watching men rule loudly and fail loudly. Her father's exile had been orchestrated by Romans, who found his desperation easy to exploit. His return, purchased with borrowed coin and public humiliation, had taught her that noise invites creditors, enemies, and expectations too heavy to carry for long. She preferred another route. Inside the palace, Cleopatra's presence became so woven into the daily fabric of court life that many forgot to question how decisions actually came to be. Edicts appeared, but no one remembered who first suggested them. Trade agreements shifted direction, yet no single advisor could recall proposing the change. Military appointments seemed natural, inevitable, as though they had chosen themselves. This was not luck, and it was not coincidence. It was the result of deliberate, hollowed-out planning guiding outcomes so softly that the process left no sharp edges behind for others to grab. The technique was especially important, given her family's situation. The Ptolemies were, by the time of Cleopatra's youth, seen by many in Egypt as foreign rulers perched precariously atop a land with its own deep, older traditions. Her dynasty's Greek roots made her position sensitive from the start. But instead of leaning into foreignness, Cleopatra took a different approach. She embraced the role of Egyptian monarch not just in title, but in practice, speaking the language fluently and participating in religious ceremonies as though she had been born into them. This was a form of soft power that Rome never understood, an ability to blend rather than dominate, to quietly become the thing the people expected, without the spectacle of conquest or conversion. When historians discuss Cleopatra's reign, they often focus on her relationships with powerful Roman men, as though her influence can only be measured by proximity to their decisions. But this view misses the subtle, daily mechanics of how she actually maintained control at home, before Caesar, before Antony. Cleopatra had already mastered a system of governance that relied not on military might or theatrical displays of sovereignty, but on the soft engineering of consensus. She knew which ministers needed small victories to keep them loyal. She knew which rivals to honor with empty titles, offering them the appearance of authority while keeping the real decisions quietly to herself. This skill extended to her management of Egypt's economy, one of the most delicate tasks for any ruler in that era. Grain was life. Control the grain, and you controlled the people not by starving them, but by ensuring they had just enough, always, and knowing precisely who owed that stability to you. Cleopatra did not announce this control. She did not send heralds into the streets to remind the population of her generosity. She simply let the shipments arrive on time, let the markets stay open, let the soft abundance of bread and oil reinforce her position more effectively than any public speech ever could. Rome, by contrast, often ruled through extraction, taking resources, imposing taxes, and making clear who was in charge. Cleopatra's method was quieter. She allowed Rome to believe it held influence, while softly maneuvering behind the scenes to ensure Egypt's trade networks remained intact, its temples funded, and its people fed. This delicate balance required constant attention. The Nile's rhythms were still the heart of the kingdom, but politics had become a second river beneath the first, flowing invisibly through negotiations and side agreements no one saw coming. And yet, this was not a form of rule that could last forever. Cleopatra knew that the softness of her strategies would eventually brush up against the hardness of Rome's imperial appetite. Sooner or later, someone would demand that Egypt stop being softly managed and start being loudly conquered. But until that day came, she continued to cultivate her still empire, layering influence like silk over stone. There are records, though faint and incomplete, that suggest Cleopatra maintained direct correspondence with other rulers in the region, not through official channels, but through private messengers who carried letters sealed without signatures. These letters, according to surviving fragments, often contained not orders but observations, notes on shifting political winds, hints about Rome's internal conflicts, reminders of shared interests that might otherwise be forgotten. It was a style of diplomacy that focused less on control and more on alignment, softly adjusting the positions of neighboring powers until Egypt remained central by default, not by demand. This way of thinking was not common in her time. The dominant model of leadership, especially in the Roman world, favored expansion, dominance, and the aggressive display of superiority. Cleopatra's approach to lead without forcing, to guide without cornering, made her dangerous precisely because it was harder to confront. How do you fight someone who is not visibly attacking? How do you topple a ruler who lets you believe you've already won, while she continues shaping the terrain beneath your feet? Even within her own court, Cleopatra allowed factions to think they were competing for influence, when in fact they were each serving a role she had quietly assigned. Some thought they were advocating for Rome, others for Egyptian tradition, still others for commerce or religion. But all of them, unknowingly, were feeding information back to her, their reports soft as dust, sifting into her private councils where she quietly stitched the pieces together. She understood something about human nature that most rulers ignored. People are more predictable when they believe they are acting freely, control them directly, and they resist. Guide them softly, and they build the walls of their own cage, thinking it was their idea all along. Cleopatra did not merely survive in this environment. She thrived. She navigated between languages, between cultures, between competing systems of law and ritual. She embodied both the Greek philosopher queen and the Egyptian goddess monarch, shifting roles as needed without ever fully committing to either. This flexibility wasn't deception, it was design. It was the architecture of soft rule, of leading through almosts and maybes rather than declarations. At times, she may have wondered what legacy this method would leave behind. After all, history prefers sharp events to soft processes. Wars are easier to remember than negotiations. Betrayals get written down, subtle redirections do not. But Cleopatra wasn't building for history's approval. She was building for survival. And survival, especially for a woman in her position, meant learning to breathe in the hollow spaces between loud empires. In the end, the real threat to Rome was not Egypt's armies or its wealth of grain, but Cleopatra herself, the way she made soft power seem like the only rational choice, the way she blurred the line between submission and autonomy until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. That kind of influence doesn't leave statues, it leaves echoes. And those echoes are still there, soft and dim, just beneath the louder stories history chose to tell. In the soft undercurrent of history, it is often easier to trace the wars than the whispers. Historians can map out battles with lines and dates, track political assassinations with names and knives. But the quieter currents, the ones that actually sustain or destroy empires, tend to vanish beneath louder narratives. Cleopatra knew this before she ever ruled officially. She understood that ancient Egypt power didn't always come from sitting on a throne or wearing a crown, but from learning to live in the spaces between certainty and doubt, guiding events so subtly that no one realized they had been guided at all. By the time she was 20, Cleopatra had mastered the art of being present without being central. She attended council meetings, yes, but often as a listener rather than a speaker. She let the ministers argue, let the generals posture, and let the merchants discuss the price of grain or the arrival of Roman ships in Alexandria's harbors. She memorized the cadences of their conversations, not just the content, but the rhythms of when they paused, when they shifted in their seats, when they hesitated before saying something that mattered. Power was rarely in what people said directly. It was in what they avoided. To rule softly is to let others believe they are leading, while you gently turn the wheel beneath the surface. Cleopatra adjusted alliances by suggestion rather than by force. She steered conversations toward conclusions she had already mapped in her mind, giving everyone else the comfortable illusion that the decisions had been collective. In this way, she avoided the resentment that came with overt control. People do not rebel against ideas they think they invented themselves. This technique served her well as she managed the complex relationship between Egypt and Rome. Rome wanted Egypt's grain, Egypt's ports, and sometimes Egypt's submission. But Cleopatra crafted a position where Egypt appeared cooperative while quietly preserving its autonomy. It was not a balance she could maintain through traditional power plays. If she had confronted Rome directly, she would have lost. If she had surrendered outright, she would have become irrelevant. Instead, she did something more difficult. She became essential. Rome needed her to manage Egypt's resources efficiently, to keep trade routes open, to maintain stability in a region that could easily spiral into rebellion. And so, she made herself into the quiet architect of that stability, someone too useful to remove, too soft to accuse of defiance, and too strategically important to overlook. By the time Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra had already positioned herself as someone who didn't just hold power, she held the fabric of the region's fragile balance. But her soft rule extended beyond foreign diplomacy. Within Alexandria itself, Cleopatra maintained a system of governance that revolved around trust and patience, two things most rulers found too dangerous to rely on. She let local governors keep their ceremonial roles, as long as they followed her subtle cues. She allowed religious leaders to continue their public rituals, knowing full well that private prayers often shifted in her direction. She allowed the wealthy merchant class to believe they were free to expand their networks, while gently guiding their ambitions to serve the larger needs of the kingdom. This system was not without its risks. Soft power requires constant maintenance. It needs vigilance, the careful observation of moods and murmurs, and the willingness to adjust course before anyone realizes you've done so. Cleopatra could never afford the luxury of disengagement. She had to remain attuned to the soft pulse of her court, always listening, always recalibrating. At night, when the palace grew still and the oil lamps burned low, she reviewed information not in the form of reports or official documents, but as patterns of behavior. Who had left the banquet early? Who had requested a private audience but then canceled at the last minute? Who had started sending gifts to Roman officials instead of local priests? These small shifts meant more than formal treaties. They were the early signals of change, soft warnings that the political landscape was tilting. Cleopatra knew that no empire falls all at once. It leans first softly, like a structure settling under its own weight. She had watched her father's court lean in this way, slowly giving way to Roman influence until Egypt's independence became a polite fiction. She resolved not to let that happen again, but she would not resist by force. She would resist by absorption. If Rome wanted trade, she would give it on Egypt's terms. If Rome wanted alliances, she would offer them through relationships that ensured Egypt's voice stayed in the room. If Rome wanted a compliant Egypt, she would give them a cooperative facade, while keeping the real levers of control in her own hands. This was not weakness, it was architecture. And she built it softly, layer by layer. She did the same with the people closest to her. Unlike other rulers who demanded loyalty through fear, Cleopatra cultivated loyalty through shared purpose. Her advisors were not terrified of her, they were tied to her. Their fortunes rose with hers, not because she threatened them, but because she had made it so that their success was impossible without her guidance. This kind of bond is more durable than fear. Fear fades when danger retreats. Interdependence remains. But even the softest system can crack if neglected. Cleopatra knew this too. That's why she paid attention to the small signs: the servant who suddenly changed his routine, the senator who stopped asking questions, the merchant who grew quiet at gatherings. These were not random behaviors. They were signals. Soft, yes, but clear to someone trained to listen. Some nights, she must have wondered how long she could sustain this balance. How long can you guide a kingdom without being seen doing it? How long before someone demands you step fully into the light, into the loud world of proclamations and spectacles? Cleopatra delayed that moment as long as she could, stretching the quiet phase of her rule across years, knowing that once she crossed into the realm of public confrontation, the rules would change. But for now, she remained in the hollow spaces, shaping events from the stillness. There is a misconception that soft leadership is easier. In truth, it requires more stamina. It requires the kind of attention that never rests, the kind of patience that outlasts ambition, and the kind of humility that allows others to take credit for your victories. Cleopatra possessed all of these, not because she was born with them, but because she had cultivated them as essential tools of survival. It is tempting, from the outside, to reduce her strategy to charm or manipulation, as though her intelligence was somehow secondary to her beauty. But that reading comes from Rome's lens, from historians who preferred their stories neat and their queens ornamental. Cleopatra was neither. She was, instead, the soft architect of a kingdom that stayed standing not because of its armies, but because of its stillness. Her whispers carried farther than most kings' declarations. Her silences held more weight than most generals' orders, and her ability to shape outcomes without stepping forward made her both powerful and nearly invisible in the official records. This is why her story feels soft at the edges, not because it was unimportant, but because it was designed to be that way. The loud parts of history are easy to write down. The soft parts are harder to trace, but they are often the ones that mattered most. The longer Cleopatra practiced soft rule, the more she understood that power wasn't something you held in your hands. It was something you wove into the room so subtly that no one noticed the pattern until they were already wrapped inside it. She did not control Egypt by issuing commands or standing at the front of processions draped in gold. She controlled it by creating a system in which the options people thought they had were quietly shaped by her long before the choices appeared on the table. Ancient Egypt power, for Cleopatra, became less about control and more about choreography, a careful arrangement of movements, glances, and decisions that looked like free will but, in reality, followed a script she had written softly in advance. This is not the kind of leadership that makes for grand stories in history books. Rome's chroniclers, obsessed with military conquest and loud spectacle, preferred tales of battles and betrayals, of speeches delivered to roaring crowds. Cleopatra gave them none of that, not at first. She preferred to operate in a register too soft for Roman ears. She listened to markets, not armies, to the timing of floods, not the declarations of governors, to the whispers in Alexandria's alleys, not just the official reports that landed on her desk. Her method was holistic. She didn't separate economics from diplomacy or religion from politics. Everything was connected, and she wove herself into those connections with the kind of subtlety that leaves no thread loose enough to pull. Her relationship with the Nile is one example of this soft strategy. The river was more than a source of water. It was the kingdom's heartbeat. Its annual floods nourished the land, dictated planting seasons, and determined the rhythm of life for millions of people. Cleopatra knew that managing Egypt's relationship with the Nile was as important as managing its relationship with Rome. She funded studies of the river's patterns, not because she wanted to predict the future, but because she wanted to understand the timing of cycles so she could align her decisions with them. When the floods were generous, she allowed taxes to soften. When the floods were thin, she quietly shifted reserves of grain to prevent unrest. The people never saw these moves as political. They experienced them as life simply continuing. But life continued because Cleopatra was carefully adjusting its balance in ways they never noticed. This kind of governance requires humility, but not the kind usually associated with weakness. Cleopatra's humility was strategic. She was willing to let others take credit for outcomes she had arranged because she knew that public credit often leads to public blame. By staying slightly removed from the visible surface of decision-making, she protected herself from backlash. If a harvest failed, it was the Nile's fault. If a trade deal fell apart, it was the merchant's error. Yet when things went well, the stability always led back to her, quietly, in the form of trust, not the loud, fickle trust of crowds, but the steady, enduring trust of those who feel their lives are gently protected by something larger than themselves. At the same time, Cleopatra never mistook this softness for passivity. She was not simply waiting for events to unfold around her. She actively shaped them, but did so in ways that appeared natural, as though the outcomes had occurred on their own. One of her most delicate balancing acts involved the priests of Egypt's ancient temples. The Ptolemaic dynasty, being Macedonian Greek by origin, had always struggled to reconcile its rule with Egypt's deep religious traditions. Cleopatra managed this relationship not by forcing Greek customs onto the temples, but by presenting herself as an Egyptian ruler in both word and ritual. She performed the traditional ceremonies, spoke the sacred language, and participated in religious festivals, not just as a guest, but as a living symbol of divine kingship. This wasn't just political theater, it was psychological architecture. By embodying both the Hellenistic and the Egyptian roles, she made herself indispensable to both sides of the cultural divide. The Greek elite in Alexandria saw her as educated and cosmopolitan, fluent in multiple languages, and versed in philosophy. The Egyptian priesthood saw her as the earthly incarnation of Isis, a protector of Mayat, the balance of order in the universe. She let each group believe she belonged solely to them, while in reality belonging to neither completely, maintaining her position precisely by never fully aligning with any single identity. Managing Rome required an even softer touch. Egypt was technically an ally of Rome, but that alliance was built on the fragile foundation of personal relationships, shifting Senate factions, and the moods of generals. Cleopatra sent frequent gifts to Roman officials, not extravagant bribes, but thoughtful tokens designed to remind them that Egypt was both wealthy and generous. These gestures were calculated. A small shipment of papyrus scrolls to a Roman scholar, a rare spice sent quietly to a senator's household. These were not just gifts. They were anchors, small, soft hooks that tied her presence to the everyday lives of Rome's decision-makers. Some historians view this as manipulation, but it was really something softer maintenance. Cleopatra understood that political relationships, like gardens, wither if not tended regularly. She didn't wait for crises to reach out. She built a system of ongoing, low-level engagement that kept Egypt at the center of Rome's attention, without ever appearing threatening. This approach carried personal risks as well. Cleopatra had to maintain a carefully managed public persona, one that shifted depending on who was watching. With the Egyptian people, she was divine. With scholars, she was a philosopher queen. With Rome, she was a partner, though never an equal, because Rome didn't allow equals. She mastered the art of self-presentation not as vanity, but as survival. To live in so many roles at once requires constant calibration. Every gesture mattered, every word, every pause, every tilt of the head. Imagine the mental energy that requires. Imagine being unable to relax fully because every conversation, every banquet, every diplomatic visit was an opportunity for subtle control or an equally subtle misstep. Cleopatra wasn't simply running a kingdom. She was constantly managing the perception of her kingdom, both within and beyond its borders. And yet, for all the complexity of this life, she moved through it with remarkable grace, not because she was above human strain, but because she understood that ruling softly is not about avoiding difficulty, it's about absorbing it. Like the Nile, she let pressure flow toward her, redirecting it gently, rather than damming it up where it could explode later. Her ability to stay still while the world tried to move her, was perhaps her greatest strength. She could let Rome believe it was in control, while guiding the outcomes that mattered. She could let Alexandria's political factions believe they were winning small victories, while ensuring that the larger picture remained in her favor. This was not manipulation for its own sake, it was protection. For herself and for the fragile independence of Egypt, in a world increasingly carved into Roman provinces. Some nights, when the palace grew quiet and the only sound was the distant lapping of water against the harbor stones, Cleopatra must have wondered how long this balance could last. She knew she could not stop Rome forever. No soft ruler can outlast a hard empire indefinitely. But she also knew that delaying Rome's appetite for total control was itself a victory, a hollow, quiet victory, perhaps, but a real one nonetheless. The softness of her strategy did not mean it lacked edge. It meant the edge was hidden, folded into the silk, like a blade concealed in fabric. Cleopatra ruled not with spectacle, but with stillness. And it was precisely that stillness that made her dangerous. There is an old idea, perhaps as old as rule itself, that leadership requires the ruler's constant visibility, that power must be seen to be believed. But Cleopatra quietly dismantled that assumption. Her approach to ancient Egypt power wasn't about presence in the loud, theatrical sense. It was about becoming the ambient condition of governance itself. You could no more separate her influence from daily life in Alexandria than you could separate air from breath. She didn't stand at the center of attention, because by the time the spotlight turned, the decision had already been made. Her strength was not in commanding obedience through force or spectacle, but in arranging outcomes so softly that no one noticed their own compliance. By the time Rome sent more envoys to Egypt, seeking closer ties and, of course, softer ways to exert their own control, Cleopatra had already anticipated their requests. She had already prepared answers, not as rigid refusals or clear acceptances, but as open-ended dialogues that kept Egypt in the game without ever allowing Rome to finalize the terms. It wasn't that she said no, it was that she said not yet, or perhaps, or let's consider together, until the urgency of Rome's demands faded into softer negotiations, where she held the pacing advantage. This was in part because she understood Rome's weaknesses better than Rome understood hers. The Roman Senate preferred directness, legal clarity, and hard lines of authority. But Cleopatra knew that empires don't actually run on clean rules. They run on relationships, on timing, on the soft management of egos and expectations. She let Rome keep its illusions of control while Egypt, under her, managed the real necessities: grain shipments, regional alliances, and the steady, unspoken promise of continued cooperation on her terms. In practice, this meant reshaping even the most ordinary interactions. When Roman diplomats came to Alexandria, they were received with elaborate hospitality. The banquets were carefully choreographed, the guest lists arranged so that political rivals sat just close enough to overhear each other, but not close enough to openly argue. Cleopatra knew how to keep her enemies distracted. She didn't silence dissent, she diluted it. By feeding all factions small wins, she made larger conflicts seem unnecessary. The result was a court where everyone believed they had a voice, while she held the chorus together in soft, invisible harmony. Her personal presence at these events was often understated. She did not dominate conversations with long speeches. She listened more than she spoke, her silences heavy with implication, her smiles long enough to create uncertainty about what they really meant. To the Romans, used to loud dominance, this was unsettling. They could not figure out where she stood, which made them uneasy. They preferred enemies who marched into view with swords drawn, not queens who rearranged the room with silence. This method extended beyond diplomacy into the management of Alexandria itself. Cleopatra encouraged the city's scholars, philosophers, and mathematicians, not because she needed their knowledge for personal pride, but because intellectual life softened the harshness of empire. A city deep in thought is a city less likely to revolt. She invested in the Library of Alexandria, ensuring that the kingdom's scribes continued translating, copying, and preserving texts from across the known world. Knowledge, after all, is another form of power, softer, but longer lasting than military conquest. Her scholars also served another purpose. They were a mirror of her own strategy. Like her, they worked in subtleties, uncovering patterns in the stars, in mathematics, in medicine, quiet discoveries that changed lives without fanfare. Cleopatra saw governance the same way. You don't always need to change the world loudly. Sometimes it's enough to adjust its angle by a fraction of a degree and let time do the rest. This was not a passive process. It required constant vigilance. To maintain soft control, you must be present in the background of every decision, guiding outcomes without leaving fingerprints. Cleopatra read daily reports, not just official ones, but the informal gossip flowing through the palace staff. She wanted to know who was anxious, who was restless, who had shifted their loyalties by a whisper. She paid attention to patterns that others missed. A senator who suddenly sent fewer gifts, a merchant who started avoiding court. These were not coincidences. They were early warnings, and Cleopatra knew how to listen to them. Her relationship with Rome's leaders, especially Julius Caesar, is often painted as a romantic entanglement in the stories that survived. But romance was only one of many layers. What Cleopatra really established with Caesar was a political alignment, a soft merging of interests that allowed her to stabilize Egypt, while Rome was too distracted by its own internal fractures to demand full control. She recognized Caesar's vulnerabilities, his ego, his desire for legacy, his complex relationship with the Senate, and she spoke to those directly, but gently, never confronting him, only suggesting, always leaving the final decision to him, while subtly arranging the conditions around that decision. This wasn't manipulation in the crude sense. It was partnership with a careful tilt. She didn't seduce Caesar with charm alone. She seduced him with relevance. Egypt had what Rome needed, and Cleopatra made sure she was the only person who could offer it without chaos. This made her indispensable, at least for a while. That is the softest form of power, becoming the answer to a question no one else knows how to solve. Yet she never lost sight of the fact that this arrangement was temporary. Rome's hunger was not for partnerships, but for provinces. She knew that eventually, the soft game would collide with harder forces, the kind that don't listen to nuance. But as long as she could, she stretched the interim, elongating the period where Egypt appeared as an ally instead of a conquest. Meanwhile, inside Alexandria, Cleopatra continued to engineer the social atmosphere. She funded festivals and public works, not as displays of wealth, but as mechanisms of continuity. A well-fed city doesn't plot rebellions. A city that sees its ruler quietly attending ceremonies, sharing meals with priests, and ensuring the market remains open even during political uncertainty, is a city that chooses stability over chaos. She knew this. She counted on it. Even in the way she raised her son, Caesarion, she practiced soft strategy. She made him a symbol not of her own glory, but of continuity between Egypt and Rome. His existence was a message, one whispered rather than declared. Egypt would not simply vanish when she did. There would be someone after her, someone part Egyptian, part Roman, someone to carry the delicate balance forward. She didn't have to say this aloud. She just had to let the image of him exist, soft and persistent, like a quiet stone placed in the path of history. Sometimes, late at night, she must have wondered what legacy this would leave. Would people remember the silence behind the throne? Would they understand how much of Egypt's survival was woven not through battles, but through delays, diversions, and careful, deliberate inaction? Probably not. History tends to favor louder narratives, but Cleopatra wasn't building for history. She was building for time. And time, after all, remembers softness better than noise. Loud moments shatter and disappear. Soft ones settle in the dust and stay. When people think of Cleopatra now, they tend to imagine the dramatic moments, the arrival in Rome wrapped in silk, the whispered stories of poison and daggers, the golden barge gliding up the Nile. But the truth of her rule, especially in the years before the final collapse, was far quieter than that. Her real work wasn't in public spectacles, but in the soft architecture of decisions made before dawn, in the hollow hours when the city was still asleep, and she could think without distraction. Ancient Egypt power, in Cleopatra's hands, became something not unlike the careful tending of a garden. You don't announce every seed you plant. You water in silence. You prune where no one sees. And if you do it well, the results seem inevitable, as if nature alone had arranged it. By the time her partnership with Julius Caesar fully crystallized, Cleopatra had already reshaped Egypt's internal machinery. She had shifted alliances so gently that her rivals didn't realize they had been neutralized until they were already part of her system. Governors who once wavered between Rome and rebellion now found themselves bound to her through favors, debts, and shared benefits. The priesthood, which could have opposed her on religious grounds, instead became part of her symbolic court, reaffirming her divine connection to Isis, while she quietly ensured their temples were funded and their rituals protected. None of this required shouting. None of it required violence, at least not directly. Cleopatra understood that ruling with a soft hand meant managing appearances, not just outcomes. She let Rome believe it was directing Egypt's future, while she shaped the daily realities that Rome had neither the attention span nor the cultural fluency to control. Grain shipments still departed Alexandria's harbors under Egyptian supervision. Trade agreements still passed through her court before reaching foreign merchants. The harbor's toll collectors, the tax scribes, the priests overseeing temple treasuries, all of them reported to her, not to Rome. And she kept it that way by letting Rome think it had already won. This kind of governance isn't just difficult, it is exhausting. To lead softly is to live constantly in the tension between appearing passive and remaining quietly decisive. Cleopatra could not afford to act impulsively, nor could she afford to appear inactive. She had to balance in a space where each gesture carried layered meaning, where a dinner invitation was a negotiation, where a silence at court could be read as strategy or threat, depending on who was watching. Her days were filled with the management of subtleties. She met with advisors not to issue orders, but to guide conversations, until the ideas they brought back to her were already aligned with her goals. She reviewed trade routes not because she needed to know every ship's cargo manifest, but because she wanted to know who depended on her for their livelihood. Dependence, after all, is a softer chain than loyalty. It binds more tightly because it feels like choice. With Caesar, her soft strategy became even more complex. Their relationship was not simply personal, though many stories reduce it to that. It was political theater performed with private stakes. Cleopatra gave Caesar something Rome couldn't offer him, the image of a ruler who could command without coercion. By aligning herself with him, she extended his legacy into Egypt. By aligning him with her, she ensured that Egypt remained sovereign, at least in appearance, without having to repel Roman influence openly. It was a partnership built on shared interests, but it was also a carefully managed asymmetry. Cleopatra knew she needed Caesar, but she also knew Caesar needed Egypt's wealth, Egypt's symbolism, and Egypt's silence. There's something deeply human about this kind of negotiation. We like to imagine history as a sequence of loud, decisive moments, but most of life happens in the soft negotiations of daily survival. Cleopatra understood this at a scale most rulers never do. She lived in the almosts, the half-promises, the soft delays, the gentle shifts in direction that didn't look like confrontation but still changed the course of events. She also knew that time was one of her greatest tools. Rome moved quickly, chasing short-term victories and immediate displays of dominance. Cleopatra, by contrast, played the long game. she could afford to wait. Egypt's agricultural cycles demanded patience. The Nile taught its people to think in years, not weeks. Cleopatra applied that same rhythm to politics. She waited for Rome to become distracted by its own civil wars. Knowing that a distracted empire is easier to maneuver, she waited for Senate factions to fracture further, for generals to clash over ego, for the structure of Rome to lean too far in one direction so that she could softly balance it back toward her advantage. This isn't to say she never acted directly. She did, but always at the moment when a soft nudge would do more than a loud command. When her brother, Ptolemy XIII, advised by his own set of Roman supporters, tried to push her out of power, Cleopatra responded not with immediate force, but with strategic absence. She vanished from the palace at just the right time, disappearing into the desert winds not as a retreat, but as a maneuver. She sent messages quietly across the Mediterranean, arranging for Caesar's intervention, not because she wanted to surrender to Rome, but because she knew she could control the outcome of that intervention better than she could control a civil war in Alexandria's streets. When she returned, wrapped in legend, delivered to Caesar in a rolled carpet, a scene so famous now it obscures the deeper meaning, she wasn't just performing theatrics. She was illustrating a point about stillness and suddenness, about appearing soft while securing hard outcomes. Her arrival wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a strategy that allowed her to re-enter power without breaking the image of submission Rome required, while in fact regaining control of her kingdom under terms she had largely dictated. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra continued this pattern with Mark Antony, another Roman figure caught between personal ambition and the machinery of empire. Again, she offered not defiance, but soft collaboration. She presented herself as the solution to his logistical needs, providing ships, supplies, and a stable ally in the East. But beneath this partnership was the same quiet architecture she had always used, guiding him, not with ultimatums, but with an environment so carefully constructed that the choices he made felt like his own, even when they had been softly curated in advance. Her palace life reflected this same duality. Publicly, she held court with elegance, attended religious ceremonies, and ensured Alexandria's streets remained orderly. Privately, she orchestrated complex networks of information, managed trade corridors that stretched from India to Rome, and adjusted tax systems in ways that kept both the treasury full and the populace calm. She held the city together, not with a heavy hand, but with soft consistency, like a weaver maintaining tension in a loom, never pulling too tight, never letting go. This method, of course, came with costs. Cleopatra lived under constant scrutiny, aware that any misstep could invite Roman intervention or spark unrest at home. She could never fully relax into her role because her entire system depended on balance, on staying just visible enough to be recognized as queen, but just soft enough to avoid becoming a threat to the larger forces circling Egypt. It is a tension few rulers endure for long, but Cleopatra endured it for years. At times, she must have wondered how history would remember her. Would it record the soft architecture of her governance, or only the final loud collapse when Rome finally came for Egypt outright? Would the subtle victories survive in memory, or would they dissolve beneath the simpler, louder narratives of love affairs and war? The answer, perhaps, doesn't matter. What matters is that for a time longer than most thought possible, she held back the tide of empire with little more than patience, timing, and the soft manipulation of human need. And for those years, Egypt remained hers not by accident, not by luck, but by design. By the time Cleopatra returned fully to power after Caesar's intervention in Alexandria, the city had already changed in ways that no parade or public decree could measure. The surface of the kingdom appeared calm. Festivals continued, taxes flowed, and the temples maintained their rituals. But beneath this stillness was a restructured world, one that Cleopatra had quietly reassembled, while most of her enemies were distracted by their own reflections. Her control over ancient Egypt power was now more deeply rooted than it had ever been, not because she had declared herself victorious, but because she had made herself indispensable to the survival of the state. This period of her rule, though less famous than the dramatic episodes involving Rome, was in many ways her most successful. She stabilized Egypt's economy, ensured the grain shipments to Rome remained consistent, and maintained social order at home while foreign powers spiraled into chaos. Yet she did all of this not by standing above her people, but by weaving herself into the fabric of daily life. Her rule became ambient, almost invisible. It wasn't that she vanished, but that she became part of the rhythm of the kingdom itself. Cleopatra's ability to sustain this system came from her willingness to embrace contradiction. She ruled as a queen and as a servant of the divine, as a woman in a male-dominated world, yet with the authority of a pharaoh, as a Greek monarch in an Egyptian land, while presenting herself as more authentically Egyptian than her predecessors. She did not resolve these contradictions. She used them. They made her difficult to define, and that made her harder to oppose. An enemy you cannot describe is harder to attack directly. Her relationships during this time reflected the same strategic balance. With Roman officials, she maintained the soft diplomacy of gifts, letters, and visits, ensuring that no single faction in Rome could fully claim her loyalty. She aligned herself just closely enough with Caesar to secure her position, but never so closely that she became Rome's puppet. After Caesar's death, when Mark Antony rose to prominence, she shifted again, not as a reactionary move, but as a continuation of her larger pattern. She adapted to changes in Rome the same way she adapted to the Nile's floods, not by resisting the current, but by letting it guide her, while subtly adjusting the boat's direction beneath the surface. This method extended to her domestic policies as well. Cleopatra funded new building projects, not to showcase her own image, but to ensure employment for her people during times when trade slowed. She invested in agriculture, personally overseeing the management of grain reserves, not as a gesture of charity, but as a political calculation. Hungry citizens rebel, fed citizens grow loyal. She understood that food security was more potent than military security. A well-fed populace is less likely to be swayed by foreign promises or internal agitators. Her management of public appearances followed a similar logic. When Cleopatra appeared in public, it was not to dominate attention, but to anchor the idea of continuity. She became a symbol of stability in a world that was otherwise shifting and uncertain. Her robes shimmered not because she sought opulence, but because the people needed to see their ruler as part of the divine cycle. In Egypt, the pharaoh was more than a political figure. The monarch was the living representation of Ma'at, the cosmic balance between order and chaos. Cleopatra performed this role softly, never overplaying it, but always reminding her people, through ritual and presence, that the balance still held. Even the way she structured her court reflected this approach. Cleopatra employed advisors from various cultural backgrounds, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and other regional voices, allowing her to hear multiple perspectives without committing to any single narrative too soon. She knew that monocultures fail quickly. Diversity of thought, especially in the soft corridors of power, was a safeguard against being blindsided by events. It also allowed her to understand the broader regional context. While Rome saw Egypt as a static land of grain and temples, Cleopatra knew it was a crossroads of trade, religion, and cultural exchange, stretching from Africa to the Near East, from India to Greece. This global awareness informed her strategy with Antony. She did not merely offer him ships and supplies. She offered him access to a network of alliances and resources that Rome itself struggled to manage. Egypt wasn't just a kingdom, it was a hub. And Cleopatra positioned herself at the center of that hub, not with declarations, but through quiet, consistent management. She made herself the axis around which regional stability turned. Remove her, and the system would falter. Of course, Antony saw some of this, though perhaps not all. Their relationship, like her earlier connection with Caesar, is often reduced to romance in popular memory. But the reality was far more complex. It was partnership, alliance, and survival braided together into something intimate yet profoundly political. Antony needed Cleopatra for logistical reasons: supplies, troops, and a secure base in the east. Cleopatra needed Antony for Roman protection, but also for the leverage that came from being associated with one of Rome's most powerful men during a period when Rome itself was fragmenting. Their union was both personal and strategic, and Cleopatra managed the balance with her usual subtlety. She hosted Antony in Alexandria, not with grand military reviews, but with slow, ritualized displays of cultural immersion. She invited him into Egypt's traditions, allowing him to experience life as a ruler of the East, not merely as a Roman general visiting a client state. This was no accident. Cleopatra understood that when people feel at home, they become easier to guide. Antony's prolonged stays in Alexandria, his participation in Egyptian ceremonies, and his adoption of certain local customs were not signs of his weakness, but of Cleopatra's success in softly integrating him into her world. Yet for all her skill in maintaining this balance, Cleopatra also knew that cracks were forming. Rome's Senate grew increasingly suspicious of Antony's time in Egypt. Octavian, later Augustus, began positioning himself as the savior of Roman tradition against what he painted as Eastern decadence. Cleopatra, in Octavian's propaganda, became the symbol of that threat, not because of anything she had openly done, but because of what she represented: a ruler who refused to be fully absorbed by Rome's narrative. She could see the storm building. She had delayed it longer than anyone expected, perhaps longer than anyone else could have. But soft power, no matter how well applied, cannot hold back hard empire forever. Cleopatra understood this. She also understood that the end of soft rule doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it just means the game has changed. Still, she continued her methods as long as possible. She maintained the rituals, kept the ships moving, oversaw the schools and the temples, made sure that the people of Egypt, for as long as she could, experienced continuity rather than collapse. Her goal was not to stop history from shifting, but to guide its direction softly until the very last moment. That final moment had not yet arrived, and until it did, Cleopatra would keep doing what she had always done, listening more than she spoke, moving quietly behind the scenes, shaping the hollow spaces between Rome's commands and Egypt's needs. Her rule was still, soft, and hollow, in the way breath is hollow not because it is empty, but because it carries life inside. There is a particular kind of kingdom that exists not in stone or scroll, but in relationships. Cleopatra built hers out of people, out of the soft ties of obligation, gratitude, shared ambition, and carefully arranged dependency. By the middle years of her reign, she had turned Egypt into not just a geopolitical entity, but a living network of connections that stretched across the Mediterranean, into the deserts, through the Red Sea trade routes, and beyond into regions Rome barely understood. She wove herself into the lives of traders, priests, scholars, and politicians so deeply that disentangling her from the system would have required destroying the system itself. That was, of course, the point for Cleopatra. Ancient Egypt power wasn't a matter of gold or armies alone. It was about being central to the machinery of survival for everyone around her. She ensured that governors and merchants didn't just rely on the state, but relied specifically on her. Grain shipments were approved with her seal, tax adjustments filtered through her scribes. Regional disputes were resolved by envoys she appointed, often sending personal letters rather than royal decrees, so the outcomes felt more like mutual agreements than royal commands. This wasn't benevolence. it was engineering. Her children, too, became part of this soft architecture. Cleopatra did not simply prepare Caesarion for rule by teaching him statecraft in the traditional sense. She introduced him to the mechanics of her system, the quiet listening, the strategic patience, the way to let rivals exhaust themselves while you maintain the soft pulse of control behind the scenes. Her younger children, the ones she had with Mark Antony, were raised within this same philosophy. They were symbols of alliances, yes, but they were also human threads woven into the broader fabric of Cleopatra's long game. Cleopatra understood that legacy was not just about monuments, but about people who remember you in the right way, at the right time. That's why she involved her children in religious ceremonies and public life, not to parade them as heirs in the Roman style, but to make them part of the kingdom's ordinary rhythm. When a child stands beside you at the temple, bows during the festival, and touches the offerings to the gods, the people begin to see that child not as a political figure, but as part of the natural order. In Egypt, where divine kingship was still a living idea, this mattered more than any military display could. Of course, Rome saw this differently. Rome viewed heirs as political assets or threats, depending on their alignment. Cleopatra's presentation of her children, particularly Caesarion, was viewed with suspicion, especially by Octavian, who understood that a living son of Julius Caesar complicated his own claim to power. But Cleopatra was not thinking only in terms of Roman succession politics. She was thinking in terms of Egyptian continuity, in the kind of inheritance that isn't just about bloodlines, but about cultural presence. Her children were not just successors. They were soft roots planted into the present to ensure the past stayed alive. Meanwhile, within this palace, the daily work of governance continued in the same soft cadence she had perfected over the years. Cleopatra met with merchants whose trade routes ran south toward Nubia and east toward India. She oversaw port operations, not with harsh regulation, but with gentle negotiation, ensuring that Egypt remained a hub of commerce without becoming a bottleneck. Goods flowed through Alexandria: silk, spices, papyrus, glass, and ivory, and with them flowed information. Cleopatra made certain she heard the news before it reached Rome: shifts in caravan routes, new alliances in Arabia, minor rebellions in distant provinces. Knowledge, for her, was not merely power, it was insulation, a way to soften threats before they sharpened. Her taxation system reflected the same logic. She did not extract every possible coin from her people, knowing that to do so would break the soft trust she had spent years building. Instead, she allowed just enough wealth to remain in the hands of local leaders, farmers, and merchants to keep the economy moving, while maintaining control over key revenue streams. This made her popular in ways Rome could never fully understand. To the Roman Senate, taxes were about control. To Cleopatra, they were about calibration, adjusting the tension between state and citizen so that neither snapped. Religion, too, remained a crucial part of this soft governance. Cleopatra's regular participation in temple life was not simply ceremonial. She positioned herself as both ruler and mediator between the mortal and divine, ensuring that the priesthood saw her as their necessary partner. She funded temple repairs, sponsored new festivals, and consulted with oracles, not because she believed the gods required it, but because the people did. In a world where fate was tied to the favor of the divine, Cleopatra's public role as a religious figure secured her political position more securely than any legion of soldiers could. She also made time for learning, maintaining her personal habit of study and dialogue with philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists. Her court remained a center of intellectual activity, not out of vanity, but because she knew that knowledge was leverage. The scholars in Alexandria's libraries were not isolated from politics. They were part of it. The more Egypt became a place where ideas flourished, the more its relevance grew, not just to Rome, but to the wider world. Cleopatra understood that soft power travels faster when it's carried by trade routes and letters rather than by troops. This intellectual circle also served as a buffer against isolation, unlike many rulers who become trapped by their own echo chambers. Cleopatra made sure her advisors included people who would tell her uncomfortable truths. She sought out not just agreement, but perspective, knowing that blind spots are often where empires stumble. It wasn't enough to rule wisely in Egypt. She needed to understand how Egypt appeared to the rest of the world, and how the world was shifting beneath the surface of alliances and trade. Her time with Mark Antony deepened this complexity. Their relationship, whatever its personal dimensions, became part of her political weave. She offered him more than affection. She offered him stability in the East. Antony, embroiled in Rome's internal conflicts, needed Egypt's resources, but he also needed the appearance of a stable partnership. Cleopatra provided both, creating a space where Antony could operate outside the Senate's immediate reach, while she continued to shape her kingdom without direct Roman interference. Their combined rule wasn't always smooth. Antony's loyalties were split, and Cleopatra knew it. But rather than confront him with ultimatums, she continued her soft method, presenting Egypt not as an alternative to Rome, but as a necessary complement to it. She didn't ask Antony to abandon Rome. She asked him to imagine a world where Rome and Egypt could coexist in a new structure, one where Eastern wealth and Western ambition could align rather than collide. Of course, Octavian saw this as a threat. In his version of history, there could be no dual centers of power, no shared vision of East and West. He began crafting the narrative that would eventually lead to war, not because Cleopatra had acted aggressively, but because she had dared to exist in the spaces Rome could not control. Still, Cleopatra continued her quiet governance. She kept the temples funded, the grain flowing, the scholars debating, and the trade routes open. She adjusted tax policies when the Nile's flood levels dipped, ensuring no famine destabilized her rule. She maintained diplomatic correspondences across the Mediterranean and beyond, knowing that Rome's reach, though vast, was not infinite. There is something remarkable about this period of her reign, often overlooked in modern retellings. While the world focused on her image, the seductive queen, the lover of Roman generals, she remained, first and foremost, a ruler of systems. She managed complexity with grace, ensuring that the daily lives of her people remained stable, even as geopolitical tides swirled dangerously close. Her rule wasn't about conquest or submission. It was about equilibrium, about holding multiple truths at once without letting any of them fall. And though the larger forces of empire would soon crash upon her shores, for now, Cleopatra remained at the center of a carefully balanced world, still guiding, still listening, still softly in control. By the time Rome openly declared war on Cleopatra and Antony, much of the groundwork for that conflict had already been laid not by Cleopatra herself, but by narratives carefully constructed in Roman forums and whispered through senatorial corridors. Octavian, eager to consolidate power, painted Cleopatra not as a sovereign monarch managing her kingdom, but as a foreign seductress corrupting Roman virtue, destabilizing Rome's men with luxury, softness, and what he called Eastern decadence. This was not a reflection of her actual rule. It was political theater, weaponizing the image of Cleopatra to justify imperial expansion. But Cleopatra understood the game. She had, after all, been playing her own version of it for years. Her response to these developments was not panic or reckless escalation. She continued, even in the face of looming war, to govern softly. While Antony prepared for military conflict, Cleopatra maintained focus on the mechanisms that had sustained Egypt during decades of political turbulence. She did not abandon her temples, nor did she suspend the grain trade. Alexandria's markets remained open. Festivals were held. Scholars continued their debates in the library, and the courts still functioned as if Rome's aggression were a distant rumor rather than an imminent threat. Cleopatra knew the value of continuity. Stability was her defense, her quiet assertion that Egypt was not a rogue state, but a vital, functioning kingdom, one that deserved to exist on its own terms, not merely as a Roman province. She also understood the emotional geography of power. People do not abandon their leaders when they feel protected. Cleopatra made sure her citizens felt that protection, not through grand military parades or hollow speeches, but through the soft assurances of daily life remaining intact. The baker still opened his shop at dawn. The teachers still gathered students in shaded courtyards. The priests still lit incense in the temples, whispering prayers for balance and order. In maintaining these rituals, Cleopatra extended a quiet promise. No matter what the world beyond Alexandria decided, Egypt would not collapse from within. Her relationship with Antony during this time has often been dramatized as a tragic romance spiraling into mutual ruin. But that is a Roman invention, a narrative designed to simplify complex geopolitics into a moral lesson about excess and downfall. In reality, Cleopatra and Antony were managing a joint crisis, attempting to preserve not just their personal alliance, but a broader regional balance that Rome threatened to dismantle. Cleopatra didn't cling to Antony out of desperation. She aligned with him because, strategically, it was her last viable option for maintaining Egyptian sovereignty. Still, she remained cautious. Even as war approached, she did not fully merge her governance with Antony's military strategies. Her focus stayed on Egypt. She ensured that supplies were managed carefully, that Egypt's fleet was provisioned but not depleted, that the royal treasury continued to support the kingdom's internal systems, rather than being emptied into the war effort too soon. She prepared for every possible outcome, knowing that Rome's propaganda machine was framing her as a villain, but that she could not afford to act like one. Soft power survives not by matching noise with noise, but by staying quieter longer. In private, Cleopatra must have recognized the danger. She wasn't naive. She knew that Octavian's framing of her as a threat had more to do with his personal ambitions than with anything she had actually done. But history is rarely kind to nuance. The Roman public didn't care that Egypt had maintained a peaceful grain trade with Rome for decades, or that Cleopatra had personally stabilized her country after years of civil war. They cared about the image Octavian gave them of foreign queen threatening Roman order, and images, once set loose, are hard to dismantle with facts. So she did what she had always done. She controlled what she could. Inside Egypt's borders, she continued to govern with patience. She made sure the temples remained open, that religious leaders stayed engaged, that trade routes stayed monitored. She kept lines of communication open, not just with Antony, but with other regional leaders, quietly sending messages, reaffirming alliances, reminding Egypt's neighbors that the world was larger than Rome and that their fates were intertwined. She understood that soft networks sometimes survive when hard alliances break. The Battle of Actium loomed, and with it came the inevitable shift from negotiation to confrontation. Yet even here, Cleopatra's role has been misunderstood by later historians. She did not push for war. She prepared for it, yes, but reluctantly. Her focus remained, even in the final months before conflict, on preserving what could still be saved, not in a grand, defiant gesture, but in the small, calculated choices that had always defined her rule. Her naval forces, though often portrayed as mere extensions of Antony's command, were structured according to her own logistical priorities. She ensured that Egyptian ships were supplied, but she kept reserve fleets in place to defend the homeland should the worst happen at sea. She arranged for contingencies, making plans for how to retreat if necessary, how to preserve Egypt's infrastructure even in defeat. This wasn't cowardice, it was realism. Cleopatra had spent her entire reign balancing between cooperation and independence, between appeasing Rome and protecting Egypt's sovereignty. She knew, perhaps better than any ruler of her time, that empires do not fall all at once. They lean slowly, fracture at the edges, dissolve through neglect before they collapse through battle. Her goal was to manage the fracture points, to keep Egypt intact long enough to negotiate a new arrangement, or at the very least, to soften the blow of conquest so that the culture and people she ruled could survive the transition. This strategy extended to her children as well. Even as war loomed, she continued to present Caesarion as a legitimate heir, not just to Egypt, but subtly, to Rome. It was a quiet challenge to Octavian's narrative, a reminder that Caesar's bloodline did not end in Rome, yet she did this without open confrontation. She let the symbolism speak for itself. A child raised in Egyptian rituals but born of Roman lineage. A bridge, not a weapon. A soft contradiction that Rome could neither fully accept nor fully reject. She must have known that Octavian would never allow Caesarion to rule, but she also knew that the child's existence complicated Rome's claims to absolute moral victory. It gave her a bargaining chip, not because she believed Rome would honor it, but because it forced Octavian to navigate the optics of erasing a child who represented both Egypt's continuity and Rome's lineage. It was, in a sense, her final soft move, a quiet, strategic gesture that lingered in the background of the conflict, even as battles approached. Cleopatra also maintained her role as religious leader during this time, participating in temple ceremonies, ensuring that Ma'at, the principle of balance and cosmic order, was still honored. This wasn't just about faith, it was about statecraft. The people of Egypt needed to believe that the gods remained on their side, that the world had not spun off its axis simply because Rome wanted more land. By keeping religious life steady, Cleopatra kept her people steady, and stability, even on the brink of collapse, is a kind of power. When the war finally came to Alexandria's shores, it was not because Cleopatra failed to lead, but because Rome refused to let her lead. Octavian wanted a world with no soft centers, no rival balances of power, no parallel systems that operated on patience and negotiation rather than conquest and order. Cleopatra represented everything Rome feared about a world that wasn't theirs. She was a ruler who survived by managing contradictions, by letting silence carry decisions, by folding outcomes into the air rather than stamping them into stone. Even in the face of military defeat, Cleopatra's approach remained consistent. She negotiated with Octavian not as a vanquished enemy, but as a ruler offering practical solutions. She proposed that her children inherit Egypt peacefully, that Rome take what it needed without destroying what was left. She wasn't trying to win the war at that point. She was trying to preserve life. This, perhaps, is the clearest marker of her leadership. She understood when to fight, and she understood when to soften the terms of loss. Her rule wasn't about immortalizing herself in legend, though history would do that anyway. It was about keeping Egypt alive, for as long as humanly possible, even if it meant negotiating from the edge of extinction. In the final months of her reign, Cleopatra found herself presiding over a kingdom suspended in ceremonial stillness, a kind of elaborate performance of sovereignty in a world that no longer recognized its legitimacy. Alexandria, once the gleaming jewel of Hellenistic civilization, remained outwardly vibrant, but everyone inside its walls understood the quiet truth: Rome's shadow had already fallen across the city. Yet Cleopatra, true to her method, did not respond with noise or defiant proclamations. She responded with ritual, with continuity, with the soft machinery of governance still running as if nothing had changed. Even as Rome advanced, she insisted on maintaining the forms of rulership, knowing that forms matter not because they prevent defeat, but because they shape memory. The ceremonies in Alexandria during this time were especially poignant. Cleopatra presided over festivals, held court in the royal palace, and appeared in temples wearing the traditional regalia of the pharaohs. These acts were not illusions of grandeur or desperate attempts to cling to a fading throne. They were calculated gestures designed to remind her people that the world still had structure, that Ma'at, the cosmic balance of life, had not yet unraveled. Ancient Egypt power had always been as much about maintaining order as exercising dominance, and Cleopatra knew that even in the face of looming collapse, performing order could soften the blow of transition. She wasn't preventing conquest, she was cushioning it. There is a profound difference between a kingdom that falls into chaos and one that drifts softly into history. Cleopatra wanted Egypt to experience the second, not the first. She continued to involve her children in the ceremonies, placing crowns on their heads in symbolic rites that the people of Alexandria watched with both pride and apprehension. The crowning of Antony and Cleopatra's children, the so-called donations of Alexandria, was perhaps the boldest of these ceremonial acts, not because it declared military strength, but because it declared imagined futures. In these ceremonies, Cleopatra and Antony distributed titles and territories to their children, as though the world had not already decided otherwise. Caesarion was named King of Kings. Ptolemy Philadelphus was given Syria and Cilicia. Alexander Helios was crowned with Armenia and Media, and Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. These were not merely royal fantasies, they were political metaphors. The ceremony was an assertion of possibility in the face of inevitability, a way of saying that Rome's expansion was not the only imaginable outcome. Cleopatra knew the real map was changing beneath her feet, but by staging these rituals, she held space for an alternate version of events, if only in the minds of her people. Historians have long debated whether these acts were reckless provocation or calculated theater. The truth is more complex. Cleopatra was not trying to start a war by then. The war was already coming, no matter what she did. But by performing these coronations, she signaled to both Egypt and Rome that she would not surrender the narrative of her reign without a final, soft resistance. The ceremonies allowed her to write, at least temporarily, her own version of history, one in which her children were not heirs to defeat, but inheritors of a kingdom still intact. This was more than symbolism. It was a psychological defense against conquest. Empires are not just territorial, they are narrative. Octavian's version of history required Cleopatra to be the enemy queen, the foreign threat, the corrupting force that justified Roman intervention. But Cleopatra's ceremonies told a different story. In her version, she was not collapsing under Roman pressure. She was expanding Egypt's vision, extending it into imagined futures that Rome could not fully erase. Even if those futures never materialized, the act of naming them gave her control over the moment. Soft rule, at its core, is about guiding perception. Cleopatra had spent her life mastering that art not through deception, but through carefully constructed truths that offered people a version of reality they could live with. Now, at the end of her reign, she used the same method, by keeping the rituals alive, by holding the ceremonies, by dressing her children in royal garments and presenting them as sovereigns. She delayed the psychological collapse of her kingdom. She gave Egypt's citizens something to hold on to, even if it was only for a little while longer. And yet, Cleopatra was not delusional. She understood that Octavian's propaganda had already poisoned Rome's perception of her. She knew that Rome would never recognize the legitimacy of her children's titles, nor allow Egypt to remain independent under her line. But soft power is not always about winning. Sometimes it is about softening loss. She wasn't trying to stop the end. She was trying to shape the way the end felt for her people, for her legacy, and for history. Inside the palace, preparations for the inevitable continued. Cleopatra managed state finances with precision, ensuring that the treasury could support the kingdom's basic functions, even as Roman forces closed in. She monitored Alexandria's food supplies, knowing that starvation would create panic long before Roman swords did. She kept the markets open, the ships moving, the religious observances on schedule. This was not denial, it was dignity. She refused to let Egypt unravel in chaos. Instead, she offered her people continuity, a soft landing, even as the ground shifted beneath them. Her personal interactions during this time also reflect this same steady hand. Cleopatra met with ambassadors, scribes, and scholars, not in desperate secrecy, but in the usual cadence of state business. She discussed regional matters, listened to reports about border activity, and reviewed legal cases brought before her. There was no grand farewell tour, no tearful public address, no abdication speech. To do so would have broken the spell of order that she had worked so carefully to maintain. Her presence, calm and deliberate, was the kingdom's last pillar. There is something deeply human about this refusal to collapse publicly. Most leaders, faced with impending defeat, resort to either panic or bravado. Cleopatra chose neither. She chose ceremony, routine, and the slow, hollow ritual of pretending things were still as they had always been. But this wasn't pretense for its own sake. It was a shield. People need time to adjust to the death of a world, and Cleopatra gave them that time. She also understood the importance of small details. She ensured that the palace staff remained paid, that no public executions marred the final months, that no scapegoats were chosen for Egypt's predicament. There were no purges, no desperate crackdowns. She avoided the panic that so often accompanies political collapse. Her strategy was, as always, to prevent unnecessary damage to the people, to the culture, and to the fragile continuity of Egypt's story. This is why her final days remain so poignant. They were not filled with rage or terror, but with a kind of soft defiance. Cleopatra was not surrendering. She was guiding Egypt through the narrowing corridor of history with as much grace as she could. She was aware that Rome's victory would not just be territorial, but narrative. They would claim to have rescued Egypt from her, to have restored order by destroying hers. She had no illusions about that, but she also knew that how a kingdom ends matters almost as much as how it begins. The ceremonies she held, the rituals she maintained, the daily rhythms she preserved, these were her way of ensuring that Egypt's end, at least under her rule, would not be written entirely by outsiders. She wrote part of it herself, in soft brushstrokes, in silences, in the hollow spaces where power is exercised without being declared. When the last ceremonies were complete, when the last temple incense had burned low, and when the final titles were whispered into her children's ears, Cleopatra had already achieved something rare. She had transformed surrender into ceremony, collapse into choreography. The empire might fall, but it would not shatter. It would drift softly, still wrapped in silk, still whispering to itself that the world was larger than Rome believed. As the days shortened and the Roman ships tightened their hold on Alexandria's harbors, Cleopatra found herself ruling over the remnants of a world carefully dismantled by time, politics, and inevitability. Yet even in this dimming moment, she refused to collapse into despair or chaos. She continued to operate as if the machinery of Egypt's state could still run on the quiet momentum she had built over decades. Her reign did not end with sudden, violent shifts, but with soft continuations of daily life, a final act of governance in the face of extinction. Cleopatra understood something few rulers ever do: the method of falling matters as much as the ascent. History remembers not only who wins, but how those who lose choose to leave the stage. She chose to leave slowly, deliberately, without giving Rome the satisfaction of watching her kingdom unravel into madness. Instead, she created a soft descent, a controlled dismantling of her world, one gesture at a time, ensuring that the foundation of Egyptian culture would remain standing even as the walls of empire were quietly removed. Her final economic decisions reflected this same careful pacing. Cleopatra did not strip Egypt's treasury to fund a hopeless war, nor did she hide away gold for personal escape. She used her resources to maintain order, to keep food in the markets, to ensure that public works continued even in the face of Roman encroachment. Her management of grain reserves remained steady, and the city's streets stayed calm, not because the people were unaware of the danger, but because Cleopatra gave them no reason to panic. She shielded them, not from the facts, but from the emotional collapse that often comes when leaders abandon their role as caretakers in the face of defeat. Even as Antony prepared for battle at Actium, Cleopatra maintained her separate channels of governance. Her fleets, though aligned with his, remained under her personal command. She saw the alliance with Antony not as a surrender of her own authority, but as a temporary alignment of interests. Egypt still had its own military, its own navy, its own reserves, not because she thought they could defeat Rome outright, but because she believed in maintaining the dignity of statehood, even when that state was under siege. Some historians have speculated that Cleopatra's decision to accompany Antony to Actium was reckless, a romantic indulgence rather than a political calculation. But this interpretation collapses under closer examination. Cleopatra was not just Antony's consort. She was a co-commander, managing logistics, overseeing supply chains, and ensuring that Egypt's interests were represented in every tactical decision. She knew that if she left Egypt's future entirely in Roman hands, or even in Antony's alone, she would lose control of the narrative and the outcome. Being present on the battlefield was not about romance. It was about sovereignty. The defeat at Actium, when it came, was not a sudden shattering of Cleopatra's plans. She had already prepared for this outcome in the quiet. Hollow spaces where soft rulers make their most important decisions. She had fallback plans in place. Her ships retreated in an orderly fashion, not in disarray. Alexandria remained prepared to defend itself, not because she believed it could hold against Rome indefinitely, but because the act of resistance mattered. It sent a signal to her people that their kingdom did not surrender at the first sign of hardship. They resisted softly, with dignity, knowing that the end was coming, but refusing to meet it with chaos. After Actium, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and resumed the rhythms of rule as if the battle had not been lost. Temples continued their ceremonies. The marketplace remained open. The scribes recorded daily events. There was no martial law, no panic-driven decrees, no public executions of suspected traitors. Cleopatra preserved the structure of the state for as long as possible, knowing that the collapse of the outer empire did not have to mean the collapse of its inner soul. In private, however, she began preparing for all possibilities. She met with trusted advisors, not to plan revenge or rebellion, but to arrange for the preservation of Egypt's cultural and religious institutions. She made arrangements for her children's safety, sending them messages through secret channels to secure their futures as best she could. She negotiated softly with Roman envoys, offering diplomatic solutions, while understanding that Octavian would likely refuse them. Still, she made the offers not out of hope, but out of principle. She would not let history record that she had failed to attempt peace. These negotiations were not grand speeches or bold ultimatums. They were quiet letters, private meetings, and the soft exchange of options between Alexandria and Rome. Cleopatra offered Egypt as a client state, proposing terms that would allow her children to inherit some form of local rule under Roman oversight. Octavian, however, had already decided the story he wanted to tell, that Rome had defeated not just Antony, but the queen who had threatened Rome's moral narrative with her foreign ways and her refusal to bend completely. Still, Cleopatra persisted in her soft strategy. She continued her ceremonial duties, participating in rituals that honored Isis, overseeing the maintenance of public works, and ensuring that the royal court functioned without visible fractures. Her method was to let the empire dissolve as gently as possible, without the violence of sudden collapse. She carried her people through the dissolution of their political independence, without dismantling the spiritual and cultural structures that had sustained Egypt for centuries. Her relationship with Antony, too, remained steady, though it carried the weariness of shared defeat. Their partnership in the final months was not the wild, passionate affair that Roman propaganda later claimed. It was something quieter and more complex, a collaboration between two rulers, trying to find a soft landing in the face of a hard empire's demands. They negotiated together, planned contingencies together, and eventually faced the reality that Rome's appetite would not be sated with partial surrender. Cleopatra could have fled. She could have packed her remaining wealth onto ships and disappeared into the east, as some advisors recommended. But she chose not to. Leaving Alexandria would have meant abandoning not just her city, but the symbolic weight of her role. She understood that rulers are not just political figures, they are metaphors for their people's survival. If she fled, it would signal to the citizens of Alexandria and to history that Egypt itself had ended. By staying, she allowed the idea of Egypt to linger, even in the shadow of Rome's victory. As her options narrowed, Cleopatra continued to engage with Octavian's envoys. She offered terms, proposed compromises, even hinted at personal sacrifice if it would spare her children. But she did this not from a position of desperation. She did it from a position of duty. A ruler's job, especially a soft ruler, is not to cling to power at any cost, but to manage the transfer of power in a way that causes the least harm. Cleopatra was negotiating not for her life, but for the afterlife of her kingdom's culture, its temples, its language, and its people. She maintained this approach until the very last days. Her meetings with officials remained calm. Her public appearances continued, and her rituals as pharaoh did not stop. In the face of Rome's unstoppable machinery, she still chose to move slowly, softly, carefully guiding the final days of Egyptian independence, not toward chaos, but towards something resembling grace. This is why, when Octavian finally entered Alexandria, he found no smoldering ruin, no desperate uprising, no palace in disarray. He found a city still functioning, still under the ceremonial control of its queen. Cleopatra's final act was not dramatic, but deliberate. She had managed to turn the collapse of her empire into a soft descent rather than a catastrophic fall. And in doing so, she preserved something larger than herself, not the kingdom in its political form, perhaps, but the dignity of its passing. She taught her people, in history, that endings can be orchestrated with the same precision as reigns. Collapse does not have to mean disorder. Sometimes, the softest exit leaves the deepest mark. There is something almost unbearable about guiding a kingdom to its end. For Cleopatra, the final days in Alexandria were not filled with dramatic speeches or desperate last stands, but with careful, deliberate actions designed to soften the inevitable. She knew better than anyone that ancient Egypt power had always been cyclical, rising and falling, like the Nile, expanding and contracting, like the breath of history itself. Her role now was not to prevent collapse, but to ensure that collapse happened in a way that preserved dignity, memory, and cultural continuity. This, she understood, was still governance. It was just governance of an ending. Her meetings became quieter, but no less purposeful. Cleopatra no longer gathered her council to plot military defenses or to strategize conquests. Those days had passed. Instead, she focused on securing the transition. She arranged for temple priests to continue their rituals uninterrupted, ensuring that the gods of Egypt would not be forgotten. Even if Roman banners soon fluttered over Alexandria's walls, she met with scholars and scribes, not to commission new libraries, but to safeguard what already existed: scrolls, maps, treatises, and records that would otherwise be vulnerable to Roman appropriation or destruction. Preservation became her final campaign. This soft stewardship of collapse is often overlooked in historical accounts because it does not fit the traditional mold of heroism. People like to imagine rulers falling dramatically, thrones overturned, palaces stormed, crowns flung to the ground in protest. But Cleopatra chose another path. She practiced what few leaders have the emotional strength to attempt. She made space for the future, even if that future would not include her. She moved through her palace like a caretaker preparing for absence, ensuring that the rooms would not decay immediately after she was gone. There was, however, one matter that remained unresolved: the fate of her children. Cleopatra knew that Octavian's intentions were not just about territory, but about legacy. By eliminating Caesarion, Octavian could erase the living symbol of a Rome-Egypt hybrid lineage and consolidate his own claim as Caesar's true successor. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. It wasn't personal, it was politics. But understanding did not make it easier. She prepared Caesarion not for survival, but for silence. She instructed him in the arts of disappearance, not in the literal sense of fleeing, but in the subtler sense of receding into the background of events until the world no longer considered him a threat. This was not cowardice. It was a last soft move in a long career of soft governance. If her son could survive without drawing Roman ire, perhaps Egypt's royal line might persist in quieter forms, through ceremonial roles or religious functions, if not through crowns. Her younger children, the ones she had with Antony, were also on her mind. For them, she arranged careful placements with trusted allies, knowing that their futures would likely unfold in Rome as hostages or political pawns, but hoping to influence the conditions of their captivity. She wanted them to live, even if it meant living in reduced roles, because life itself was a kind of resistance. Continuation mattered. Existence, even under Roman terms, was better than erasure. Privately, Cleopatra maintained correspondence with remaining allies, though she knew most were shifting their loyalties to Octavian. That was expected. Soft rulers do not resent the inevitable flow of political gravity. They simply work with it, shaping the descent rather than trying to halt it. Cleopatra's letters were not pleas for rescue. They were soft reminders of shared histories, gentle nudges toward mercy for those who would soon be in charge of rewriting the official record. Even in her personal routines, Cleopatra maintained control. She still rose at the same hour, still walked the palace corridors as she had when Egypt was at its height, still consulted with her physicians and astronomers. The difference was in the focus. Now she asked her scholars not about future projects, but about the mechanics of legacy. She inquired about embalming practices, about burial rituals, about how symbols might endure beyond their temporal bodies. She was preparing not just for death, but for the narrative after death, the version of herself that would linger in the minds of those who survived her. Her final audience with Octavian's envoys was, by all accounts, calm. She received them in full regalia, dressed not as a fallen queen, but as a living goddess, embodying Isis as she always had during state ceremonies. This was not an act of denial. It was a final soft defiance, a reminder to Rome that Egypt's cultural identity would not vanish simply because a Roman general demanded it. Her message was clear. Though unspoken, you can take the land, but you cannot fully take the meaning of the land. The symbols survive. Octavian, meanwhile, prepared his own version of events. His propaganda painted Cleopatra as dangerous, excessive, manipulative, a queen who had seduced Roman virtue into ruin. He needed this narrative, not because it was true, but because it made his conquest palatable to the Roman public. It is easier to justify empire when the defeated ruler is portrayed as a threat to moral order. Cleopatra saw this strategy unfolding in real time. She knew the role she had been assigned in Rome's story, but she refused to perform it on their terms. Instead, she constructed her own ending. Her final days were spent in a kind of hollow grace, moving between political arrangements and personal reflection. She reviewed Egypt's financial records one last time, ensuring that debts were settled and that temple treasuries remained untouched. She walked through the palace gardens, where the last of the summer flowers still bloomed. Knowing that she would not see them return in the spring, she spent time with her children, not preparing them for revenge, but for resilience. And then, when the moment came, she chose to exit softly. Her death was not an act of theatrical self-destruction, as Roman accounts often suggest, but a carefully measured refusal to be paraded through Rome in chains. Cleopatra understood spectacle better than anyone. She had built an empire on avoiding it when necessary and using it when it suited her. Becoming part of Octavian's triumph was not an option because it would give Rome the final word. Instead, she reclaimed the last decision for herself, turning death into the final act of soft rule. There are many theories about how she died: snakebite, poison, or perhaps a more clinical concoction delivered by her physicians. The method is less important than the meaning. Cleopatra's death was not a surrender. It was a boundary. It was her way of saying, "You may have the land, but you will not have me." Her body, prepared with the same rituals she had ensured for the temples and for her people, was treated as both queen and goddess, wrapped in linen, anointed with oils, and placed beside Antony in the tomb she had commissioned long before this final chapter began. In that tomb, she curated not just a burial site, but a symbol, a final piece of soft architecture meant to remind history that her life had not been solely about power, but about the quiet maintenance of culture, identity, and continuity. Cleopatra's death marked the end of Egypt's political independence, but it did not erase Egypt itself. The temples continued. The language lingered. The rituals outlasted Rome's initial attempts to overwrite them. Even in defeat, she had succeeded in protecting something essential not by building walls, but by creating pathways that could not be easily destroyed. Soft rulers are rarely celebrated in the traditional narratives of conquest and empire, but Cleopatra's style of leadership, her ability to manage decline with grace, and her insistence on dignity, even in loss, left an imprint that no Roman victory parade could fully erase. Her story became legend, not because of how loudly she lived, but because of how softly she ended. And sometimes, it is the softness that lingers longest. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. The world that followed Cleopatra's death was not one she would have recognized, not because Egypt vanished, but because the careful, hollow structures she had built to cushion the fall were slowly, methodically hollowed further by Roman hands. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, absorbed Egypt not just as a province, but as a personal possession. The Roman Senate did not manage Egypt. Augustus did, treating the once great kingdom as his own private estate, bypassing traditional Roman administrative systems to ensure direct control over the Nile's wealth. This was not governance. It was quiet conquest, dressed in the robes of order. Cleopatra had anticipated this, of course. That is why she had spent her final months arranging for the survival of Egypt's internal culture rather than its political borders. She knew the difference between rule and ritual. She understood that Rome could seize the grain, the ports, the palace, but the soft systems of belief, tradition, and memory would be harder to dismantle. The priests continued their chants. The scribes kept copying texts in temple scriptoria. The people still observed the festivals of Isis and Osiris, still looked to the Nile with the same reverence, still traced the same symbols into the air when they prayed for balance. Rome, for all its military might, could not erase these habits overnight. Yet there was loss. The children Cleopatra left behind became symbols of both hope and tragedy. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was swiftly executed on Octavian's orders. His death was not announced with fanfare, but carried out softly, in the background of Rome's broader reordering of the world. Octavian could not allow a living heir of Caesar to compete with his narrative of sole succession. Cleopatra had tried to shield her son by preparing him for disappearance, but Rome had no patience for soft exits. They preferred final ones. Her other children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome, displayed briefly in Octavian's triumph, and then handed over to be raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister. This, too, was part of the Roman soft conquest, by absorbing the children of Egypt into Roman noble families. Octavian sought to erase the cultural distinctions that Cleopatra had so carefully preserved. But culture, like memory, is not so easily scrubbed clean. Cleopatra Selene, for example, went on to rule as Queen of Mauritania alongside King Juba II, weaving fragments of her mother's methods into her own reign, balancing Roman expectations with local traditions, quietly continuing her mother's legacy of soft governance from another corner of the empire. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, life did not collapse. It continued, reshaped but not erased. The city became a Roman possession, yes, but it also remained a cultural and intellectual hub. Scholars still gathered in the libraries, even as Roman officials walked the streets in new robes. Egyptian priests still conducted their ceremonies, though now they offered prayers alongside Roman taxes. Cleopatra had structured things this way on purpose. She had left a system designed to survive occupation not by fighting openly, but by continuing softly beneath the surface of imperial control. This is not the story Rome wanted told. Roman historians, writing decades after Cleopatra's death, preferred the version where she was a dangerous seductress, undone by her own ambition. They wanted her to be the foreign queen who threatened Roman virtue, the cautionary tale of Eastern excess. But the truth was more complicated, more human, and more difficult to erase. Cleopatra was not a conqueror undone by hubris. She was a caretaker of decline, a ruler who understood that when faced with unstoppable forces, the only real power left is in shaping how the end unfolds. Her death, like her life, was wrapped in symbolism. The image of the asp, the snake that delivered death in a soft, silent strike, became legend. Whether or not the method of her suicide involved an actual snake hardly matters now. What matters is the metaphor, a death that arrived quietly, by choice, without spectacle, without permission. She refused Rome the triumph of dragging her through the streets in chains. She chose her own curtain call, and in doing so, she preserved the last piece of sovereignty left to her. This act reverberated through history, even in defeat. Cleopatra's choice became part of her legend. She became a symbol not of failure, but of control maintained to the very end. Her method of ruling, softly, in shadows and silences, with patience and calibration, was mirrored in the way she chose to die. No loud proclamations, no grand refusals, just a soft withdrawal into myth. And that myth lingered over centuries. Cleopatra's image was recast again and again, sometimes as a lover, sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a tragic queen caught between empires. But beneath those layers, the real legacy remained a ruler who had mastered the art of staying in the room long after louder powers thought they had taken over. Her strategies may have been erased from official Roman records, but they persisted in the soft echoes of the systems she left behind. Her death did not erase the institutions she built, the rituals she maintained, or the intellectual pursuits she encouraged. Alexandria continued as a center of learning, albeit under Roman rule. The temples carried on their ceremonies, some for centuries more. Egypt did not disappear. It adapted. And that adaptation was part of Cleopatra's design. She had ruled softly, knowing that softness survives invasion better than steel. When Rome fell centuries later, much of what survived from that era was not the names of generals but the texts and traditions safeguarded in places like Alexandria. The ideas Cleopatra protected outlived the legions that had tried to erase her. Knowledge is a form of soft power, and Cleopatra understood that long before modern historians gave it a name. Her own memory followed a similar path. Rome could not fully erase her story, no matter how hard they tried to control the narrative. Instead, she became a figure woven into countless legends, stories, and retellings. Some remembered her as a manipulator, others as a tragic heroine. But beneath all of that noise, there remains the quiet truth of her rule. She governed not by force, but by arrangement, not by domination, but by balance, not by spectacle, but by stillness. Even now, the image of Cleopatra carries with it a kind of hush, a sense of mystery, of echoes in marble halls, of whispered negotiations behind closed doors. Her legacy is not a single event or a grand victory. It is the soft architecture of influence that outlasts the builders of empire. She is remembered not just for how she ruled, but for how she ended, not with a fall, but with a chosen exit. This, perhaps, is the lesson that lingers. History often celebrates the loudest conquerors, the ones who cut borders into maps with swords. But there is another kind of ruler, the kind who shapes the air between empires, who guides without commanding, who dissolves rather than destroys. Cleopatra was that kind of ruler. Her reign may have ended in Roman conquest, but her way of ruling survived it, carried forward by those who understood that softness is not weakness. It is endurance. She became, in the end, what she had always been, a queen of hollow spaces, of quiet control, of influence that persists long after the loud voices have gone silent. And perhaps that is why she still lingers in legend, in memory, in the soft shadow history cannot quite erase. Long after Cleopatra's body had been sealed in its tomb, long after Octavian returned to Rome, carrying the illusion of finality, Alexandria remained quietly alive beneath the empire's new banners. The statues were not toppled overnight. The temples were not burned. The scholars did not stop writing. This was not because Rome had grown merciful, but because Cleopatra had left Egypt structured in such a way that sudden collapse was not possible. She had prepared her kingdom not for permanent independence that had become impossible, but for survival within absorption. Her soft governance, crafted over years, was designed precisely for this moment, the transition from sovereignty to subjugation without the total loss of identity. The ordinary people of Egypt understood this in ways historians often forget. To them, the passing of queens and kings had always been part of life. Dynasties rose and fell, but the festivals continued. The harvest still required offerings. The Nile still needed its prayers. Cleopatra had preserved this rhythm. She did not dismantle the rituals when Rome approached. She did not shift her kingdom into a state of emergency that would have ripped apart daily life. Instead, she kept the machinery running, so that when Rome finally arrived, it found not a shattered state, but a functioning society. This, in its own quiet way, was a kind of victory. Her court, too, carried forward fragments of her system. The scribes continued to record events in both Greek and Egyptian scripts. They maintained the habit of duality that Cleopatra herself had mastered, the ability to operate in multiple languages, to think in multiple systems, to exist in both the Greek and Egyptian worlds simultaneously. Even Rome, for all its power, could not fully break this habit. It became part of Alexandria's DNA. Some of Cleopatra's officials transitioned into Roman administrative roles, but they did so carrying the methods she had taught them: negotiation over confrontation, subtlety over spectacle, patience over haste. They adapted to Roman rule by softening its edges, ensuring that the transition felt more like a change in management than a cultural erasure. Cleopatra had trained them well. They understood that the goal was not to stop change that was impossible, but to control its texture, to make it less abrasive, less cruel, less complete. Even in death, Cleopatra's fingerprints remained on the city's pulse. Her tomb, though its exact location has been lost to time, was not just a burial site. It was a statement of continuity. She chose to be interred alongside Antony, but not simply as a lover in a tragic romance. Their joint burial was a political symbol, a final echo of the unity she had tried to build between East and West. By choosing this resting place, she left behind a message that Rome could not fully erase the idea of a shared empire, a hybrid world where cultures blend rather than conquer. For Rome, absorbing Egypt was about resources, grain, gold, and geography. For Cleopatra, the end was never just about material loss. It was about whether the spirit of Egypt would survive the transfer, and in many ways, it did. The temples remained active for centuries after her death, some well into the Christian era. The hieroglyphs continued to be carved, the old gods worshipped, the festivals held in the same seasonal cycles. Cleopatra had left behind a culture so embedded in daily life that no conqueror could fully remove it. This soft survival was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices. Made over years of rule, Cleopatra had consistently prioritized cultural preservation alongside political maneuvering. She understood that the outer layer of empire could change hands, but the inner layers, the layers that governed how people thought, how they prayed, how they related to the land, those could endure if protected properly. Her policies had always reflected this dual focus. She invested in religious institutions, not just as acts of piety, but as acts of statecraft. Temples were not merely places of worship, they were centers of learning, of record-keeping, of social cohesion. By keeping them strong, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt's cultural memory would survive Rome's military dominance. This was a form of governance that looked soft on the surface, but was structurally resilient. Her legacy, then, is not measured solely by the political headlines of her time: wars lost, alliances broken, kingdoms absorbed, but by the subtle persistence of Egyptian identity long after Rome claimed the land. Cleopatra did not prevent the empire's fall, but she prevented its erasure. That distinction matters. Most rulers are remembered for how they expanded or defended borders. She is remembered for how she managed decline, for how she cushioned the fall so that it became a glide rather than a collapse. In the generations that followed, Alexandria remained a beacon of intellectual life. Roman scholars studied in its libraries. Philosophers from across the empire gathered there, debating in the same halls Cleopatra had walked. The city's role as a cultural hub outlived its political autonomy, and that survival traces directly back to her soft strategies. She had built systems that could function under multiple flags. Rome's eagle flew over the city, but Cleopatra's methods still shaped its daily rhythms. The echoes of her rule reached even further. In Mauritania, her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, ruled as queen, bringing with her the lessons of a mother who had taught her how to balance loyalty with independence, visibility with discretion. Selene introduced Egyptian elements into her court's ceremonies, blending cultures as her mother had done, softening political edges through cultural continuity. Cleopatra's legacy, through her daughter, became part of North Africa's history too, a quiet extension of her influence beyond the Nile. Rome, for all its efforts, could not fully control the narrative either. Over time, the image of Cleopatra in Roman texts evolved from villain to fascination, from cautionary tale to complex icon. Her story outlasted Octavian's version of events. The memory of her did not fade into the background of imperial propaganda. It grew, took on new shapes, whispered in the margins of historical accounts, resurfaced in art, literature, and legend. Her life became a story that Rome could not fully own. Soft rulers leave soft footprints, but those footprints last longer than the bootprints of conquerors. Cleopatra's strategy was never about dominating the historical record. It was about embedding herself into the corners of history that no one thinks to erase, the festivals that continue, the languages that overlap, the rituals that endure even under foreign rule. Her reign was not about loud victories, but about gentle persistence. In the centuries after her death, Egypt changed hands many times. Empires rose and fell, religions shifted, new languages took hold. But through it all, Cleopatra's imprint remained not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker of transitions. She ruled during a time when the world was tilting from one era into another, and she chose to guide that tilt softly, without letting it become a crash. This is why she still matters, Not because she defied Rome successfully, she did not, but because she understood that some defeats are survivable if managed carefully. Her genius was not in winning battles, but in controlling how loss unfolds. That is a rarer skill, and a harder one to teach. Her life reminds us that power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, moves quietly, shapes the air without being seen. And when it does, it leaves traces that last far beyond the headlines of conquest. Cleopatra's Egypt may have fallen, but her way of ruling softly, strategically, patiently remains one of history's most enduring lessons in how to navigate impossible times. Perhaps this is why, even now, the image of Cleopatra lingers, not as a defeated monarch, but as a presence, not quite gone, not quite silenced, still waiting, softly, in the corners of memory where history forgets to clean. By the time Cleopatra became a story, rather than a sovereign, her influence had already stretched beyond the reach of the empire that defeated her in life. She ruled a kingdom threatened by forces far beyond its borders, in death. She became an emblem not of defeat, but of defiance by endurance. Her rule had always been about continuity of meaning, of memory, of rhythm, and the residue of that method clung to Alexandria and the Nile Valley long after Roman banners were hoisted above the palace where she once held court. The stories Rome told of her were meant to finalize the narrative. Octavian, now Augustus, crafted his version with precision. Cleopatra was cast not as a queen, but as a disruptor, not a strategist, but a temptress, not a ruler, but a ruinous detour in Rome's righteous march toward dominion. This wasn't merely political slander. It was a calculated attempt to reduce her from a sovereign agent into a historical device, something to be blamed for Mark Antony's downfall, and something Octavian could conquer, metaphorically and militarily, in one motion. But Rome's narrative, even with all its power and repetition, never truly erased hers, because Cleopatra's story was never told in proclamations. It was carried in quieter places in the priest, who kept a shrine lit even as governors changed. In the mother who named her child after a goddess Rome considered forgotten. In the scholar who passed on treatises smuggled from Alexandria's older archives. Her power, which had always been exercised softly, continued in that same softness, one not easily dislodged by force. Octavian did parade her children through Rome. He turned Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios, and Ptolemy Philadelphus into props for a triumphal march meant to humiliate the memory of their parents. But even then, it was not as final as it appeared. Cleopatra Selene would go on to become queen in Mauritania. Her court blended Egyptian, Hellenistic, and Roman aesthetics. She reigned not with vengeance, but with balance, a continuation of her mother's legacy, shaped into a new mold. This was not survival despite defeat. It was survival through adaptation. It was the soft governance of the defeated, which often outlasts the victories of the conquerors. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the shape of Cleopatra's rule continued to influence daily life. Roman officials, unfamiliar with the full intricacies of Egyptian religion and administration, relied heavily on the existing local hierarchies, priesthoods, scribes, and merchant councils that Cleopatra had kept intact. Rome did not rebuild Egypt from scratch. It ruled through her architecture. The tax systems she had refined remained in place. The grain quotas she had carefully balanced continued to be the foundation of Egypt's economic significance. The temples she had endowed still carried her name in cartouches carved alongside those of gods. There were changes, of course. Latin began to appear alongside Greek and Demotic in official documents. Roman governors imposed new laws, and Roman troops patrolled the cities. But beneath these overlays, the structure remained recognizably hers. Cleopatra had not just ruled a kingdom, she had composed it, like a piece of music, with recurring motifs and carefully timed pauses. And that composition endured because it was designed not to resist change, but to flow around it. It is easy, In retrospect, to view Cleopatra as a figure consumed by the tragedies of her final days. But to do so is to miss the broader rhythm of her reign. She did not rule for herself alone. Every decision she made, every temple she repaired, every child she educated, every diplomat she received was part of a longer view. She was not preserving the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was preserving Egypt, or at least the version of Egypt that could persist under the weight of an empire that saw itself as eternal. The weight of that task is rarely acknowledged. It is one thing to build an empire. It is another thing entirely to shepherd it toward its twilight without letting it shatter. Cleopatra managed this with a kind of internal discipline that would exhaust most leaders. She never gave in to despair publicly, never abandoned the rituals that anchored her people, never permitted her court to dissolve into panic. She understood that power, when handled softly, is not something you hold, it is something you carry. And when the burden becomes too heavy, you don't drop it, you pass it forward. Her people understood this too, in their own ways. For decades after her death, stories about her circulated in Egypt that bore little resemblance to the Roman histories. They described her not as a destroyer, but as a wise ruler, even a philosopher queen. Folk tales began to sprout that blended her image with that of Isis, not just in state cults, but in the intimate language of households and small temples tucked into the countryside. These weren't acts of political rebellion. They were expressions of cultural memory. They were the final phase of her rule, diffuse, intangible, but profoundly lasting. To the modern reader, it may seem strange that a queen who lost her war, who took her own life, and who saw her children paraded as captives, could be considered victorious in any sense. But Cleopatra understood something more durable than battlefield success. She understood how history flows, how it compresses, how it expands, how it loops. She knew that Rome would write the first draft of her story, but she also knew that if she curated the right kind of silence, that story would not be the only one that remained. In the carved lintels of temple doorways, her name continued to appear for generations. Roman governors, fearing unrest, often left the old ceremonies intact rather than risk disturbing the equilibrium she had crafted. Even as Rome imposed taxes and demanded grain shipments, it also maintained the priesthoods and paid for the festivals because Cleopatra had designed the system in such a way that to remove any one part would unbalance the whole. She did not just leave behind memories, she left behind a living infrastructure of softness. And there is one more layer to this endurance. In the centuries that followed, Cleopatra became not just a historical figure, but a mirror reflecting the values, anxieties, and dreams of every age that rediscovered her. Poets saw in her the lover undone by passion. Playwrights saw the tragic queen caught between empire and selfhood. Modern readers see a complex woman navigating power in a world that was never designed to let her keep it. Each of these reflections carries some truth, but beneath them all is the quiet foundation she laid. The one few ever talk about, a style of rule that privileged durability over glory, rhythm over reaction, presence over performance. This is why she is remembered, not because of the war she lost, but because of how she managed everything before and after it. She governed a kingdom not through domination, but through arrangement of people, of systems, of symbols. And in doing so, she achieved something rare in history. She became part of the land itself, part of its story, part of its breath. Rome could conquer Egypt, but it could not fully absorb her. The floor of her palace has long been lost beneath the harbor's silt. Her tomb remains hidden, perhaps forever. But the space she carved in history, softly, persistently, patiently, that still remains open. The end of Cleopatra's story is often told as if it were simple. A queen defeated, a kingdom absorbed, a woman reduced to a cautionary tale about ambition or romance, depending on which historian you ask. But the truth, as it always is in history, is much quieter and much heavier. Cleopatra's reign did not end with the loud crack of catastrophe. It ended the way soft power often does, through a series of choices made in private, behind closed doors, designed not to stop the inevitable, but to shape how the inevitable would unfold. Her final acts were not about defiance or spectacle. They were about timing, memory, and control. After Octavian's forces secured Alexandria, he wanted one thing above all: to bring Cleopatra back to Rome as a living symbol of his conquest. He wanted her displayed in chains, walking silently behind his chariot in the triumphal parade that would cement his transition from a political operator into the first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone. She had spent her entire life studying how power moves, not just on battlefields or in Senate chambers, but in the spaces between. She knew that in Rome's eyes, her capture would be the true victory, more valuable than the annexation of Egypt itself. Her defeat as a ruler was only half the prize. Her humiliation as a woman and queen would complete the spectacle. But Cleopatra had no intention of becoming a Roman trophy. She refused to be turned into a symbol of surrender, paraded for the amusement of an empire that had never truly understood her kingdom or her reign. Her death was not an escape, but a final, calculated refusal, a last act of soft governance. She chose her own exit because, in a world where all other choices had been taken from her, the manner of her departure was the only decision left that still carried weight. By deciding how and when she would leave, she denied Octavian the final piece of theater he had scripted for her. The method of her death has been the subject of endless debate: an asp hidden in a basket of figs, a vial of poison, a concealed blade. The details are less important than the meaning. Cleopatra, the master of soft rule, orchestrated her death with the same precision she had used to govern. She staged her final scene not for Rome's benefit, but for her own. She chose silence over spectacle, stillness over chains. Her death was not the end of her power, but the final exercise of it. In the days that followed, Octavian's soldiers found her body alongside Antony's, just as she had arranged. The two were buried together, as rulers and as partners not in defeat, but in chosen unity. Rome would write the official version of this story, of course, framing it as a conquest of decadence by discipline, of East by West, of disorder by order. But the truth was more complex, and it rippled softly beneath the surface of Roman records. Cleopatra had known all along that she could not defeat Rome militarily. Her strategy was never about victory in the traditional sense. It was about outlasting, outmaneuvering, and when necessary, out-enduring. Her reign was built on patience, on soft alliances, on managing timing rather than force. She let others believe they held the reins while she adjusted the route. And when that was no longer possible, she chose to step off the path entirely, leaving Rome to inherit a kingdom it did not fully understand. Egypt under Rome became a possession, but never fully a province in the way other conquered lands did. Augustus kept it under his personal control, treating it as his private estate, bypassing the Senate. This was not merely political strategy. It was an acknowledgement that Egypt was too different, too delicate, to be folded completely into the Roman system without risking disruption. Cleopatra had designed it that way. Her soft governance left behind structures too intertwined with local identity for Rome to dismantle completely, without unraveling the very resources they came to control. The temples continued their ceremonies long after her death. Priests maintained the old rites, the chants rising from sacred spaces, even as Roman soldiers patrolled the streets. The scribes kept writing in Egyptian scripts alongside Greek and Latin. The marketplaces still operated in rhythms Cleopatra had calibrated over years. Even in defeat, she had ensured that the ordinary flow of life did not stop. The people mourned her in whispered prayers, in soft retellings of her story, in the quiet persistence of traditions that Rome could not erase. Her image persisted, too, not just in monuments but in memory, For centuries, Cleopatra was not forgotten. She became a symbol sometimes of beauty, sometimes of tragedy, sometimes of cunning, but always of presence. Her story slipped into poems, plays, scrolls, and later, into the fabric of countless retellings across cultures and eras. Each generation reshaped her, but none removed her. She lingered in the background of history, not because she had wielded the largest armies or conquered the most land, but because she had ruled with a style that left no single thread for history to pull loose. Soft rulers do not leave loud echoes. They leave patterns, traces in the sand, arrangements in the air, systems that persist because they are embedded, not imposed. Cleopatra ruled in this way, and she ended her reign in the same manner softly, without spectacle, choosing the moment of her own exit, leaving behind a structure that outlasted her body. Her children's futures were, in many ways, the last part of this soft legacy. Caesarion was killed. Could not tolerate even the faintest shadow of Caesar's bloodline competing with Augustus. But her other children survived, their lives woven into Rome's noble families, their cultural memory lingering in ways Rome could not control. Cleopatra Selene carried her mother's methods into Mauritania, ruling quietly but effectively, blending cultural traditions with political pragmatism, echoing her mother's balance of softness and strategy. Cleopatra's legacy is often misunderstood because it does not fit easily into the framework of empire building. She was not a conqueror in the Roman mold. She was a caretaker of continuity, a guardian of culture, a ruler who understood that sometimes survival requires flexibility more than defiance, patience more than aggression, arrangement more than domination. She practiced a leadership style built on timing, on understanding the undercurrents of human behavior, on guiding outcomes without forcing them into place. Her life, and especially her end, challenges the way history usually talks about power. We are taught to celebrate victory and condemn failure. But Cleopatra's story is not one of failure. It is one of maintenance, of managing decline with grace, of softening collapse, of preserving what can be preserved when the tides turn against you. That is a different kind of leadership. It is harder to spot in the historical record because it leaves fewer monuments, but it lasts longer because it lives in the patterns of ordinary life. In the centuries that followed, as Rome expanded and eventually declined, echoes of Cleopatra's governance remained in Egypt's cultural resilience. The language shifted slowly, but the rhythms of belief and tradition persisted. The Nile still rose and fell. The festivals still aligned with the lunar cycles. People still whispered prayers to the same gods she had honored in her lifetime. Even as new rulers claimed the throne, Cleopatra had ruled for survival, not for glory, and in that, she succeeded more profoundly than the generals who thought they had defeated her. Her life was not a tragedy. Though Rome tried to write it as one, it was a lesson in endurance, in quiet control, in soft rule. She governed in the hollow spaces where politics meet culture, where diplomacy meets timing, where leadership is not about loud declarations, but about long, patient breath. And when the time came to leave, she did so on her own terms, with the same calm precision that had defined her reign. She has never fully left. Her story loops back again and again in history's quieter corners, reminding us that not all power needs to be loud to last. Some of it can be soft, still, and hollow, like a chamber that holds memory long after the voices inside have faded. You've come far enough for one night. Let the quiet carry you now. And if sleep hasn't come yet, maybe this softened the weight. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, sleep softly. Let yourself fall back into the room you're in now. Maybe it's darker. Maybe the air feels softer than when you started listening. Somewhere, perhaps the fabric beneath you has warmed slightly from your stillness. The world hasn't changed much while you've been here, but your place in it might feel quieter. That's enough for now. The story of Cleopatra wasn't just about power or politics. It was about knowing when to hold on and when to let go, when to push forward, and when to drift softly into the background. She carried her kingdom until the last moment, not because she believed she could stop time, but because she believed in guiding it. That's something we rarely talk about when we talk about rulers, the ones who guide us softly toward endings that don't break us. Maybe there's something in that for you tonight. Not everything in life needs to be won. Some things just need to be carried carefully, then set down gently when the time comes. The past is heavy, but it doesn't have to crush you. Sometimes it just needs someone to hold it for a while, then whisper it into the quiet. If you've stayed this long, maybe something in this lingered. If it did, you can leave a comment, even just a soft word, or where the night found you. I read them all. This is Boring History Nights, and you're always welcome here, especially when the rest of the world is asleep. You've heard enough for now. Let the story finish itself without you. And if you're still awake, maybe the silence felt less alone this time. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, drift softly and stay.